my favorite definition of democracy is dictatorship by the masses, dictatorship of the masses. That means the majority feeling like their will is being exercised, that they are, that they are being seen and felt in politics, that decisions being made are benefiting the majority of the nation.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Edem, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I just have well, sorry, as an academic, part of what we do is to critique what other people have said, right? And what we're thinking about the things that they're saying. I just have a critique of this definition, which is that if you say a dictatorship of the masses, okay, that it means that in cases where the masses are not right in a certain context, then it means that marginalized people, for example, do not necessarily get to have a say. So I am thinking currently what's happening in Ghana with the anti-gay bill, where majority of Ghanaians are saying that, oh, this is what we want. We want you to pass this bill. But then there's also a section of Ghanaians who are queer, but who are in the minority. So it does not, from what I said, it does not it give room for nuances. And in this specific case, the majority is not exactly right. Do you see what I mean? So that's just my critique of that definition of democracy as a dictatorship of the majority.
That's so interesting. Oh, I love this already. That's great. That's a very good point. Is the voice of the masses, or at least what is perceived to be the masses, what if it is?
You're asking me to my own definition. I think that I don't have a definition of democracy. I think so far it's just the textbook government of the people, by the people, and for the people, which is what I think Lincoln said. Even with that I have known, I am always critiquing these things. So I'm saying, so for example, if you look at how democracy works in other contexts, like in the Americas, in Africa, we say
Institute of
Hello?
Hi, sorry, I don't know how. I don't know why.
Okay. Can I go ahead, or should I hold on?
No, go ahead.
So, for example, I think the part of the problem that we're experiencing within the African region is that we don't have a proper understanding of democracy, or the way that we understood democracy was thrown out for this modernized or foreign way of practicing democracy. So I don't have any better definition, really. It's just I'm just critiquing. Or I felt moved to sort of point out something that I think could be it's not encompassing of like of marginalized perspectives, when sometimes they can be actually marginalized, or people who are in the minority can actually be right about something. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Okay, so we got a few hands here. Okay, Ruel, I think you're next.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I think it's tricky with democracy. I don't know whether when it comes to democracy, we can consider, as Edem is saying, right and wrong. Like, I do agree that, yes, sometimes the masses are wrong. I think in terms of a definition for democracy, it's a tricky one, but I would say something along the lines of a society kind of ruled or making decisions based on a selection made by the masses. And I say selection in particular because sometimes the options that are given, it's a bad place or a worse place. And they're just making the making a decision based on the best of two bad things. And obviously, and I think the question of whether the masses are right or wrong, or the marginalized are right or wrong, is separate from the question of what is democracy. That's not to knock what you're saying, Edem, at all. I just think democracy is normally you're given a bunch, or you're given options, and it's what the masses choose. Often I agree that the masses normally choose incorrectly, but I also, I would just say it's essentially what the masses choose out of a select number of options, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So before I call on the other one, so when I was putting this together yesterday, I came across this definition in the Journal of Democracy. Who knew there was such a thing as a Journal of Democracy? And it says, modern political democracy is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their elected representatives. I was gonna have that in the background, percolating, whilst we get the other hands. Kim, I think you were next.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. This isn't necessarily a definition, more so an observation of what I think the root purpose of democracy is to give a voice to everyone. So everyone gets an opportunity to say their piece about whatever is happening in their environment, in the society, in their area, whatever. And I think it then leads on to what Ruel just said, selecting. So whatever the highest, the main themes are, that's what you vote on. But the point of democracy, from my understanding and my perspective, is that everyone gets an opportunity to share their views. That doesn't mean to say that all views will be part of the selection. They may not be key points, but I think if we think about what democracy is supposed to produce, there is room for even the most marginalized people to have parts of what it is that they need, or parts of what it is that they are demanding. But that requires governance that is very interested, dedicated, intentional, and open-minded. If they're not that, if they've got ulterior motives, or if they don't have the necessary knowledge, skills, resources, interest, then certain things won't be able to take place. And I give an example. In the early 2000s, I think, we started to see a shift towards ableism and disability in the UK. And that only came about because of very specific things that were happening in society. Now, those groups are still very much marginalized groups. They're still very much underrepresented. They're still very much oppressed and discriminated against. But there have been many laws passed and many practical things that have been implemented on a day-to-day to improve their existence in the UK. Being able to get on the bus if you've got a wheelchair, and then having a priority on the actual bus. Being able to apply for jobs that you otherwise wouldn't have applied for if you're partially blind, for example. Being a receptionist and being partially blind, you can still get the job because there's software that employers are required to make accessible to the right candidate. Their ability or disability shouldn't exclude them from particular roles if they have the relevant skills. So those are just a couple of examples where the marginalized group can be represented in a democratic environment, but there has to be the intention, there has to be the interest, there has to be commitment to it. It has to be something that is, actioned upon. That's what I want to share.
That is great, Kim. Thank you very much. Fiavi?
Yeah. So I think I want to make a contribution to where the definition of democracy has been an issue. I think to the largest extent, Africa has been practicing democracy for a very long time until the introduction of European democracy. I think that is where our means of being accountable has been stagnant. Africans, as Bontu have said, that a democracy that is defined by Russian as a dictatorship by majority. I think that is what has actually made African where we are going now. That to say, we those who are born in Africa, I am a pure traditionalist. I'm sorry. It's not a way of introducing my religion. But there are certain things we abide to. But when you look through how governance in Africa perform, they don't stick to their code of conduct, or maybe the oath that they swear to office. People say A, and when they get to office, they do B. So the people who are calling them to be accountable to their actions, some are also doing it with ill faith. So everybody is more or less playing a mind game using the word democracy. But African, as Edem has said, that Africans might not understand democracy. Democracy has been well understood in Africa in centuries until the introduction of European democracy, which exempted powers in the hand of few people by creating the associate within the corridor of power, and everything is being controlled by them, but still it is being called democracy. There's no symbol of punishment. People are only being punished in a court, which is being formed by the same government. People being punished by the police, which is being recruited by the same government. If you have the upper hand, nobody punish you. You go away, you go scot-free with your crime or whatsoever that you have done against the people of the country. So I think Africa's introduction of the European democracy, that's where our problem generated from. We have lived by democracy. Nobody is being marginalized in the society. Everybody get his fair share of what he deserves. Nobody is being marginalized. Everybody is equal before our sisters. But until the introduction of the democracy from Europeans, everything has changed. So Africans do understand democracy perfectly. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw Pauline's hand, but it's gone down. Did you want to say something, Pauline, or?
I think what my point has kind of been covered by a few people. I was just going to say, even before you brought up the text, I was thinking, when I think of democracy and how it's defined, well, just think of it overall. The words that come to mind are accountability, but then that comes with transparency as well. And like sometimes, when one is missing, that it's quite hard for the other to actually, be there. So like when there's no transparency, it's quite hard to keep people in power accountable. And then that's kind of like where the downfall, so to speak, comes. So so I just wanted to share that. So I really like that definition because it's kind of like in line with what I was thinking, but also transparency, which allows us to keep them accountable.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much. So the point of this whole event really was to discuss how we can. So a lot of the diaspora are making plans to move to Ghana. Not just Ghanaian diaspora, it's actually kind of Black people from all over the world are planning to move back to Ghana. But there are sort of issues that I can kind of foresee coming. The first thing, the very prevalent thing, is that the diaspora voices seem to be absent when it comes to issues on the ground. So when it comes to that, Galamsey is the kind of backdrop of the conversation that we're having today. We're going to bring Daryl on to start that conversation in about 2 minutes. But raising awareness of that. And Galamsey is something that, for those who don't know what Galamsey is, it's small-scale illegal mining. And what's happening with the small-scale illegal mining, again, I'll get Daryl to talk about all of that, is that, in short, it's basically destroying the water and the land in Ghana. And it affects everybody. So as people are trying to raise awareness about this and call the government to account, I've observed that I'm part of quite a few diaspora groups, and it's just not part of the conversation. But I also see that a lot of us are very interested in what's happening in American politics, right? What's happening in Donald Trump won, and that people are having in-depth analysis about the American election, but we seem to be very kind of disconnected as to what's happening in our own spaces and what the implications of that are. But also, as an activist, I'm very curious as to how we can bridge that gap, how we can connect with people from the diaspora to kind of address some of these issues. But also on the long term, actually, I think that if the diaspora continue to isolate themselves from the local community, we're almost going to end up in a bit of a genocide, right? Where the locals are angry, rightly so, I would say, about the diaspora kind of setting up their own, their own kind of exclusive communities and their own exclusive schools and hospitals, while still kind of almost using the locals as for labor, right? So that's kind of the backdrop of the discussion. And so we've structured it in a way where we're looking at what's happening on the ground in Ghana at the moment, which Daryl is going to talk about. And then we're going to talk about the broader kind of global perspective, looking at it from sort of the China-Africa perspective, which Tenielle is going to talk about. Then we're going to look at the role of activism and the media, which Edem's going to talk about. And then we're going to look at it from a sort of legal, constitutional framework to kind of try and bring it all together, which Oliver's going to talk about when he joins us. And then we're going to restart the discussion, if that makes sense, as to how can we actually address some of these issues and engage the diaspora more broadly. So, Mr. Daryl, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Fabulous. Okay, so we're going to start your interview questions. So could you just briefly, I don't know if you're able to turn your camera on so that people can see.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly, for the people that have just joined us, introduce yourself?
Great. So once again, my name is Daryl Bosu, an ecologist by training, but over the years I've transformed into somebody who engages in local community empowerment, basically looking at the local community commerce and how that fits in within their overall development goals. Also looking at how national level policies and also regional level have impact positively on communities and the way they're able to assert themselves in the way they meet their livelihood needs. And now a lot of my work focuses on business and human rights issues within the extractive sector. So I'm a full-time practitioner, but I'm also with training in green business modeling. And I've had my first degree in natural resources ecology, and then also MPhil in the same field. I finished LLB not too long ago, so hopefully I could join Oliver in the courtroom very soon to advocate for community rights and also for human rights issues. So today I'm happy to share with you the developments in Ghana related to the environment and how we can all, particularly those in diaspora, can support all the solutions that Ghanaians are pushing for down here. Thank you. I've requested to share my slide. I have a few slides just to take me through the presentation. So if you allow me, I will appreciate that. Let me see if I can do that now.
I think I'm allowed. Yeah, I've allowed.
Okay, great. Great. Okay, so I'm going to be speaking to the environmental issues, and basically, I think there were some cues in terms of questions for me to try and respond to. And once we start talking about these issues, I'm sure all of us know where we are going to, what the issues we are going to be paying attention to, and specifically to start with. I mean, I'm just going to show you a few slides just to bring you to keep you focused on the presentation I'm making. But this slide you are seeing on the screen now is many years ago, many years ago, and that was somewhere around 2016. But I can tell you that if you travel anywhere in the country and you come across a river this good, this clean, I mean, then I'm sure you have been transformed into another realm, not in Ghana. So this is what's our reality now is. This is our reality now. I mean, so I'm speaking to the issues of the environmental challenges of our time. And you can't talk about the environment without already trying to ask yourself, what do you immediately see around you? And we used to see very clean rivers, lush forests. And I'll say, if you are somebody who grew up or have listened to your parents talk about where they come from in Ghana, they talked a lot about how there used to be, I'll say, wild animals almost everywhere. I mean, I've worked in almost all of every part of the country across several regions, and a lot of work even in the north, where you see animals come into the town. I guess some of you know about Boabi, Fiema, and all of that. In the southern part, southwestern part of Ghana, which is more the cocoa regions, high forest zone, there is a lot of also wildlife in these areas, but that is not the same anymore. And so talking about the issues that is really now critical to us as in terms of Ghana's environment, the biggest issue we are facing now is with environmental destruction, particularly coming from galamsey. And the definition for galamsey, as has been said, yes, is about illegal small-scale mining, but that has evolved because galamsey, as we know it to be, used to be more of anybody going to the ground, going to collect gold, processing it and selling. And then it came to people also doing illegal, even those with permits and all of that. But we have evolved the definition of galamsey to also cover even irresponsible mining. So it's not only somebody who is illegally doing a mining activity, but somebody who even working within the remit of legality or remit of the law also does not follow, lay down procedures and processes for really going about their mining activities. And then when we talk about irresponsible mining, we're also talking about leaders who are not ensuring due diligence in the granting of mining concessions and leases, allowing miners to go and destroy community lands, abusing the rights of communities, and even also destroying other critical essential needs of society. So galamsey now could be illegal mining, not having a permit and doing mining. It could be also somebody doing legal mining who has a permit but not doing the right thing. And if you're a leader and you're not also ensuring due diligence in terms of the issuance of mining concessions and leases, you're also engaged in galamsey. And galamsey, as we know, has come to really shape our landscape now. I can say within the last almost 20 years, it has become one of the biggest drivers of deforestation in Ghana, and also destruction of our water bodies and rivers. And this is something we see very much around us. And I have to say, nowhere in Ghana is spared. Our forest reserves are affected. Our cocoa farms are affected. And the picture you are seeing now, the one on the left is a forest reserve. The one on the right is a cocoa farm, where you have seen the miners really sitting right at the boundary, the edge of the cocoa farm, digging away. And you get to see in some few months, they will go into the cocoa farm and actually raise it down as well. And this is also, this has become very common since all over. If you travel from the south of Ghana towards the western regions, almost to the Ashanti region, there was even a time where the miners were blatantly digging the center of Konongo Township. And it's only Konongo. If you go to Abbeyquaye in the western region, if you come to the eastern region, Osino, if you come to Chebi areas, the miners really know no bounds now. They are digging away and they don't care what the law says, because they know that it counts with no consequences if they engage themselves in illegal mining. And you can even see that our hills and mountains are not left untouched. The right image you see is actually miners sitting on top of the mountain and really digging up there and letting the waste flow down to the downstream, and all the people around there, you can imagine what is going to happen to them. And we acknowledge that galamsey, as has been said, many people have said that it is happening because there is a need for livelihood. And that has been the excuse many people have given. The question is it really about livelihood, or rather is about people living large? some years ago, if you asked me whether it's about livelihood, then I could have said yes, because then there was a question of the government giving out mining leases to big, say, corporate companies, but the communities who were living close to these areas were not getting the benefit of this. And also, how was government using the resources in a way that could benefit everybody outside the mining communities? Then it translated to politicians now making an excuse that if the boys are hungry and there's no job to do, why don't you allow them to go and dig anywhere, whether they have licenses or not? And then the excuses also became the fact that the Minerals Commission is not able to process concessions on time. So the longer it takes to process a concession, that means that people can be allowed or can find a way to go and dig even before they get their mining leases, which has also been one of the biggest drivers of galamsey. So yes, people have used the excuse of livelihood as a reason for mining. But if you really go in depth and do an analysis, it's not just about livelihood. There's also a very big element of greed, which is pushing people. And as you know, is moved from greed for people's sustenance and also lifestyles to even shaping and funding political parties. And that's why we realize that even this particular election Ghana finds itself in, a lot of the financing for DCs or for MPs or parliamentary candidates, all of them, they are having to scrape the land and also use that to fund their political activities, which is putting our economy. And when I say economy, I'm talking about other sectors of our economy that has been a source of revenue, like the cocoa, other crop production that we've been engaging, other services like tourism and all of that, which has seriously been affected. And with galamsey also has come the issues of our exposure to the water pollution, the risks, and also some of the heavy metals that comes with the water pollution, cadmium, mercury, lead, all of them, you can think about them. And all of these come with some consequences that all of us are not prepared for. And even if we are, I don't think that we have the capacity to really take care of some of the risks that we are going to be exposed to in the future. Aside that, we've also seen that galamsey has also exposed a lot of communities to several social vices. I recall we met with some women's group as to what they think about galamsey, and the response was that initially they thought it was come to really help them improve their local commerce, as so to say, but eventually they saw other vices creeping in, their children no longer going to school, and also a lot of the things they used to do, criminal activities coming into the community and all of that. So all of this has sort of exposed communities to certain risks and certain social harms that initially was not a problem for them at all. And it has also come with significant trade-offs. I mean, this picture for me tells a lot. This is a mining site where you can see an excavator, and this is a particular community somewhere in the eastern region. This mining community has actually been mining close to a community, almost in the center of it. The communities have been complaining for a long time, but there was nobody to speak for the community. Neither the chiefs or the local government authority was willing to act on it. And it's sad to see that even if the community had to go and get water, they need to go past the mining site before they can get their source of water. And that's how come you see these two kids trying to walk across the mining site to go and get access to water that was close by. So it tells you how the state has neglected to protect citizens that they promise or they vow or sworn an oath to protect. And that's why I think that galamsey, even though it's bringing, yes, some economic benefit, its other impact on society far outweigh any benefit that we can claim to get from that. I talked about the impact on water bodies, and significantly, I mean, the record shows that it's only in the Volta region and maybe the Volta Lake that you don't see galamsey affected. But aside that, every other major basin in this country, major river in this country is polluted by galamsey. And the key concern here is also the fact that almost all of Ghana's water treatment facilities draws from the rivers and streams running across the country. And if all of these rivers are polluted with heavy metals like cyanide and mercury and the others, for which the water treatment process does not eliminate, then you obviously can infer that all of us whether you are in the city or even at the community level where you are drinking directly from these polluted rivers, we are all at risk from health risks and associated diseases coming from the pollution that Galamsey is routing on our environment. Now, this is a typical, I would say, dynamic in some of the communities. You can see the water treatment facility, the area marked out in red, drawing directly from a polluted river like that, serving a town not so far off. And for almost every community in Ghana, this is the scenario that is playing out. In Accra, we draw our water from, say, Weija Reservoir. Weija Reservoir gets its water from the Densu River, and the Densu River comes from the Atiwa Forest. So along the route from Atiwa all the way to Weija, it gets contaminated, diverted, or even there's some winning in there and all of that. So all the pollution that goes into the reservoir, eventually we are going to be exposed to. And this is how serious Galamsey is really exposing all of us to it. Aside the impact on our water bodies, there's also very serious impact on our food systems. And this is something you realize that we have always been talking about, our water, but nobody's really talking about the food system. Because we depend on the land for our food, we don't grow our crops in space, you need to be concerned about where your food is coming from. And it will interest you to know that most of the food crops that we are eating now, they're also coming from the same regions where pollution activity from Galamsey is happening. And pollution does not only come from somebody planting on the land where Galamsey has happened directly. It could also be that contamination can also spread. And we've seen this effect in many areas. If you go to a Newmont mining site in the Ahafo region, 5 kilometers away from where the mine site is actually happening, communities living 5 kilometers away are also affected by the pollution from the chemicals that the company is releasing even into their sediment ponds. So it tells you that Galamsey anywhere also raises risks for the crops that are produced, and that also translates to cash crops. You have also heard about recent concerns about Ghana's cocoa quality. A company supposedly in Swiss selling chocolate made from Ghana cocoa is currently facing some series of lawsuits as a result of heavy metal contamination. And we in Ghana are supposed to brace ourselves for the rippling effect of that civil lawsuits on our cocoa supply chain. So these are issues we need to, but interestingly, nobody is talking about it. The state doesn't seem to care about it. And this is where I believe that we need to pay attention and deal with it. Andre, please do prompt me and give me prompters if I'm not doing good with time, because it looks like I have quite a lot to speak about, but I'll try to keep it short after this point on the Galamsey. And then there are also several cross-sector impacts. Galamsey or mining or illegal mining, responsible mining as we see, is one particular that displaces everything else. It displaces water services, it displaces food security issues, it displaces health issues. So if you want to achieve, a socioeconomic development, as Ghana is saying, we want to develop sustainably, increase the prospect for Ghana, and the government is saying that they want to make Ghana the mining hub of Africa, then what we need to be preparing ourselves for is the fact that our food security issues, our water services, our health issues are seriously going to be compromised, because the way we are seeing it being done, there is no due diligence and there's no care or concern for the rights of communities where these mining activities are happening. We've seen how Galamsey has led to serious, I would say, losses in other sectors like the Ghana Cocoa Forest Emissions Reduction Program. So our government goes to sign a contract with the World Bank for $50 million for actions that will plant trees and also reduce deforestation. Then Galamsey comes to destroy all of them. Ghana Cocoa Board goes to AFDB for financing for cocoa rehabilitation, $300 million. Galamsey comes and destroys all of that. And because of Galamsey, our government is busy borrowing at the expense of the public to do rehabilitation. Now, the question we've always asked is, where are the mining companies who were busy mining in these areas? How come we are not going back to these mining companies to ensure that they pay up for the cost that they are routing on communities? We are the international community, asking the international community to release funds for climate resilience and adaptation. But when you really look at it, the problem is not coming from there. It's coming from our own leadership here, who are not taking the lives and also prioritizing the well-being of citizens as part of the things that we do to develop. And then also there are several other quality issues that we'll talk about our cocoa. Currently, as we speak, Ghana's cocoa production capacity has dropped from close to 1 million tons every year to less than half that capacity. And this is also because almost all the areas where galamsey, where cocoa used to be grown and had good yields have all been destroyed by galamsey. So it means that we're not going to be able to benefit as we should from the yields from the cocoa that we get from it. Then there's another issue in terms of environmental challenge that we are facing now, to do with air pollution. And this is the analysis on the left is coming from a World Bank Country Environment Analysis Report, somewhere 2020. And it's talking about the fact that nearly 16,000 people die from air pollution in Ghana. And this is coming from pollution, from electronic waste burning and all of that. And it's a very, very serious issue, and we are not taking note of it. The vehicles that we encounter on the road, the exhaust that is being pushed out there into the environment and all of that contributes significantly to the air pollution that we are exposed to. And then it's something that usually we don't take. I know there's already national level processes to get some of these issues resolved, but the issue is still a problem that we really need to address. So this slide provides some information on some of the critical environmental issues Ghana is confronted with. And if you look at the numbers, if you look at the impact, if you look at the cost of GDP, they are all very staggering, and it's something that you cannot take for granted. Let's talk about overfishing. We have Chinese foreign fleets, fishing in our economic zones, whilst we tell local fisher folks that they can't fish during certain periods of the year, which is unfair, whilst Chinese fishing fleets are busy working. And then we are also experiencing a lot of coastal erosion as a result of the increasing sea level rises, also happening as a result of climate change. So these are issues that really are presently challenging, are big challenges for us in terms of environment. There is the issue of climate change, but I'm always very not so quick to really mention the issue of climate change, because the issues of flooding in Ghana is an issue that, particularly in the cities, you always say that they are all artificial flooding, may be coming from poor management of our waste. So we're not managing our waste well, is also clogging our drains and also allowing for some of these floods to occur. Maybe in the north, when there are issues of the Barker Dam being opened and flooding coming to the southern part of Ghana, is also an issue. I think is also artificial, because we decided to put a few dams there and we did not engineer how the water will be used further downstream. And that is why we have issues of the flooding coming from Burkina Faso and also affecting communities in the south.
Sorry, sir. 5 more minutes, yeah?
5 more minutes. Okay, great. There's a lot to talk about, isn't it? Then you asked, I think there was also the point about how can government be held accountable for addressing these issues. So for me, if you're talking about environmental sustainability, if you look at Ghana's development pathways, everything government wants to do, and I'm taking this from Budget Statement 2024, from planting for food and jobs, everything government wants to do, water supply for cities and all that, it all depends on our ecosystems and also on our natural assets. So the best thing for government to do is to prioritize nature in its entirety, but not only take one and work with it. At the moment, government sees there's so much value in the minerals, in the gold, in the lithium, in the bauxite, but government has not taken time to ask themselves, what's the value of the water we get from Pra to service all the people in the Western region? What is the value of the water that comes from Atiwa Forest, servicing over 50 million people? Assuming you buy this water every day from a shop, how much is it going to cost? Then you realize that the gold or the lithium or the bauxite is not so much worth much more than the water service. And that's something I think that the states need to do. I also think that in terms of accountability, we don't have independent institutions, and that boils down to the issue of democracy. The way we are really implementing or experiencing democracy is not what it's supposed to be. We have state institutions who do not put out information voluntarily, but citizens must demand for those pieces of information before they get them. We have state institutions we must invoke laws to demand for some information before that is provided. And this is something that is not going to help with judicial use of our natural resources. There's also no transparency. We know how much, the government will tell you that if we do a particular mining venture in a particular area, it's going to bring about 5,000 jobs, it's going to bring 2,000 jobs. That is always never true. We've heard about the prospect for the job creation in the petroleum hub in the western region around the Nzima area. They've quoted over 80,000 jobs to be created. We know that is not true. They talked about bauxite mining in the eastern region and Yinehini going to create over 20,000 jobs. We know that is not true. There is no transparency, there's no accountability, because we are not being truthful to the issues that we really talk about. And then it also asks about what examples are there to show in terms of environmental restoration, particularly in relation to Galamsey. And you realize that citizens have asked for a state of emergency to allow government to sit and reflect on the best way forward. Ghana is not the only country that has had to invoke a state of emergency approach in dealing with Galamsey. Peru did it, China did it at some point, South Africa at some point in their life also did it. And it tells you that it can be done. We are not just taking advantage of it. We are still prioritizing wealth and gold over the lives of Ghanaians. There are several restoration opportunities or projects in parts of Africa. And the very good example I can give is Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, for some 20 years ago, used to have very degraded, arid lands, and they had to go through a national process of restoring their landscape. And now, from a dry patch country, you see very green, large vegetation in almost all of their areas. And this is something that can be done. We've also heard of the Green Great Wall Initiative that is being implemented in the Sahel regions of Africa. It's starting, it's moving, it's slow, but the prospect for success is great. So for me, I think it can be done. If you go to the northern parts of Ghana, there are projects that are being run by World Vision that is deploying initiatives like naturally assisted regeneration initiatives. And there's also what you call farmer-assisted natural regeneration. All these are assisting nature to develop. So we know in the north it's very dry in some parts. So you see a stump, then you help it by pruning and for the shrubs to turn into trees. And these are ways that very successful initiatives have been initiated in the northern part of the country, and it's been very, very successful. How can communities also balance economic development? I think that answering that question lies with our institutions really doing a comprehensive analysis of the assets that we have as a state. For a long time, we've talked about development only in terms of what we can take and sell, but we are now also talking about what we can take, add value, and maintain as it is, and then use that to leverage for international funding. We talked that there's opportunity for carbon-based initiative for projects that communities can do, several opportunities for tourism. There are countries in this world who don't have the minerals Ghana has got, like Costa Rica, like Ecuador, but are thriving just by preserving their ecosystems, paying for the ecosystems, and also exploring green commodity value chains. And that's an opportunity that we are not leveraging. I like government's program to say one district, one factory. But if we're really going to do that, that means that we need to ensure production, and that production should be sustainable to ensure that the factories can keep using the raw materials from the farms or from wherever to produce the goods that can sell to the world. But right now, if you look at how we are projecting one district, one factory, but at the same time, the very land that are going to be the productive spaces for the production of raw materials and all that. We are destroying them with galamsey and all the mining interests of the state. Then it tells you that the state is not ensuring a balance when it comes to pushing for sustainable development. So there is a lot to be done, and we need to assess all our assets equally and not prioritize one over the other. I'm sure there will be opportunity to speak to some of these issues when questions come from the floor. So I'll end here, and I welcome any questions that may come. Thank you.
Wow. I've spent a bit of time kind of looking into galamsey and the effect and the impact, but seeing it all together like this is quite it's very harrowing, I would say. Okay, Fiavi.
Okay, the speaker made mention of Volta region being the only region that has not been affected by galamsey. And in his presentation, it was like government has been so adamant to protect the lives of Ghanaians. But since the diasporas want to come in, what are the measures to protect Volta region from taking the share of galamsey and then the environmental degradation?
That's a very good question. Sure, let me answer that. So I think you've asked a very good question, and I believe that to really keep Volta region from the menace of galamsey will start with strong local advocacy. And that local advocacy can benefit from the international, our brothers and sisters out there also adding their voices to it. Sometimes when you see some of these local advocacies going on, you see people get discouraged because the international brothers and sisters out there don't support. And I recall one time I managed to get myself onto a school's platform, and I was talking about mining, environmental sustainability. And the people who came very hard at me were the people who were living abroad. And all that they said was that if US didn't use their resources, how did they get here? And so if I'm in Ghana and you are saying that we shouldn't use our resources, and they will tell you that mining is inevitable or environmental destruction is inevitable if you do mining, and we need mining to develop. Now, the question is, we've done mining for over a century. I mean, how is it that we think that doing mining now with the little space that we have is going to change anything? So I think that, yes, to start with, we need to have a very strong local advocacy. And then we also need to have a network of support from the international community, from groups that can really support some of these local advocates. Otherwise, I mean, but it will all eventually rely on local strongholds, local communities, local people championing some of these advocacy, and very strong diasporan support system coming to add to that. Because as you see, I was really happy that when our president was at the UN, we had some Ghanaians out there go and meet the president and tell him that, look, what you are doing, you shouldn't be here because you should go back home and fix the water bodies. And that's something I think that we need to be doing. We shouldn't, but unfortunately, we see some Ghanaians take their political affiliations from Ghana when they go to the international, when they go out there. So when they are talking about issues that really bothers on human rights, on well-being, they even bring in those political interests and affiliations and alignment, and can also somewhat discourage some of these advocacy actions locally. So I think that it's important, but building strong local advocacy systems is a way to go.
Bontri.
Good again. Thank you very, very much for your presentation, brother Bosu. I wanted to ask you, have you read either Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism or his Class Struggle, or like say Frantz Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks? Have you read any of those books?
I've read some books by Nkrumah, but maybe I don't know which particular one you are referring to, because it comes in a range. Yeah.
Okay, because the issue I see with so much of the galamsey conversation is that we're starting it from a really like a stage where we are not aware that our ancestors, to call Nkrumah an ancestor, has already predicted that this was coming around our national resources.
Mm.
We are that is the condition we're in, and actually that's why I've been trying to figure out how to frame this conversation, because I was understanding that it was going to be sort of a conversation positing that returned Africans, whether it be historical diaspora or returnees as they used to call us, are actually shaping up to become an oppressive force in of themselves. But it looks like this is going to be a conversation, and I would rightly agree with that positioning, about neocolonialism, which Nkrumah has already described. Everything you are saying around our resources, not only not being used for our benefit, but being intentionally used to antagonize us, have already been predicted. We have a situation now where I always compare the Galamsey practitioners with drug dealers in the West, Black boys who are dealing drugs in the West. Same way, they don't have the shipping equipment and the logistics equipment to bring drugs into the country. Here in Ghana, we do not have, the boys who are doing the Galamsey do not have shipping to bring in the earth movers and the caterpillars. They don't have the money to clear those things. They don't have the diplomats who are giving the Chinese buyers, sorry about that. They don't have the Chinese buyers to give them visa access to the country and all of this. So these are things that are happening at a level that if you leave out the political machinery that is engineering this, you give a beautiful presentation, but the presentation doesn't cover facts that are already known on the ground. So then you do your presentation a disservice, because if you are not factoring in accepted facts that have been accepted by economists of all kinds for 50, 60 years, that are in Nkrumah's books, then in 2024, if you're making reference to a subject without those key elements, then you do yourself a disservice to help people understand, whether they are here in Ghana or whether they are abroad, what exactly is going on. Because if you've got people who are listening to your presentation thinking that these boys who are doing it are the problem, it's the same as people who are saying that people on street corners in various Western urban areas have got access to the Colombian cartels and the shipping and the helicopters and all of that brings the things to the country. We have to understand what the real problem is, and that is known. So I would please ask, those 3 books that I've recommended, please look them up, read them, and add them. You won't take away anything, because all the facts and figures you are bringing are still in play. All it will do is add a lot of nuance and needed context, so that when people are listening to your presentation, they are aware of what's really going on. They don't think that the people who are in the news, the people who are being captured by the media, are the ones who have got anything to do with the machine that is really happening, the mechanics of this neo-colonial crime, atrocity that Galamsey is. You understand? So thank you very much for your presentation again. But to make your presentation even better, I would please ask that you add that our leaders and our scholars, our whatever you want to call them, our elders have done the work to make our work easier. We are supposed to stand on their shoulders to make our work then stronger and to make their work more relevant to the current time. If we leave it out, then we're starting from scratch every time. So yeah, thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Maybe a little clarification, which is good. Abonchi. So I think I agree with you, and I think you'd be surprised to know from me that I don't believe it is the people we see in the pits who are responsible for the Galamsey. The Galamsey, as we describe it now, is not about those who are in the pits with their headpans and pickaxes and trying to get something to go and feed their families. No, that is not what Galamsey is about now. Galamsey now, just like you rightly described, is more an issue run by cartels of the states, syndicates who bring in resources. And I'll tell you, it's not even the Chinese who are responsible for this. It's Ghanaians who are fronting for the Chinese, Ghanaians' own greed. And just like you mentioned, if you're supposed to go back to the issues of neocolonialism and even slavery and all of that, the question is, who sold us into slavery? We went, captured our own people and handed them over. And that is the same thing we're experiencing now. You see the state that has got the resources, the machinery, everything to enforce the laws, and they tell you that vote for us. When you vote for us and we win the election, in 3 months we'll make your water bodies clean. So we know what is happening. We just refuse to deal with it because we have an interest in the gold. Yes, the world, it will surprise you, the world is finding ways to ensure sustainability in all of some of these minerals and all of that. They started with black diamonds. They brought in some measures and regulations to deal with the atrocities associated with the extraction of diamonds. Now the world is just cracking its brain, trying to find out how can we ensure that there is sustainable gold? Because the issue is not about some Chinese coming down to Ghana to go to the Western region to do galamsey over there. It is a Ghanaian that goes to China, brings the Chinese and says, I need your money, I need your machinery. It's more of an investment. So the question is, what kind of investment are we inviting into this country? And this is something that is led by our own leaders. So the person in the pit we see on television, they are just for the optics, but those people really behind. And that's how can you have issues where persons connected to the government or the party in power are involved in illegalities. The minister comes out publicly to say, this person, the chairperson for Wontumi, I should say, chairperson for the MPP in Ashanti region is involved in illegality, but the police refuse to even crack their whip on such a person. And this is what is happening all across the country. And you see PCs, parliamentary candidates, everybody promising, I will allow you to do galamsey if you vote for me. This is impunity at its highest level because the state agency that is supposed to secure the well-being of citizens have refused to do that. And that is something I think we cannot always blame the West or other people for what we are experiencing. A lot of the problem we are facing is coming from our own people. And that is why when we are communicating the issues, we need to be very, very direct. We should not exonerate our leadership. They have failed Ghanaians, not foreigners failing Ghanaians. It is our own leaders failing Ghanaians. And that is why the description of democracy needs to be dealt with because there are several nuances. And when you come to Ghana, I don't think that we are implementing democracy as it should.
Wow. Okay, we're getting deep. Ken, can you keep it to like 2 minutes, only because we're a little bit over. We are going to have an open discussion in a second section. So Ken, 2 minutes, please.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My question, you already answered it a bit in the first question that you answered, but I'll have still ask it, so maybe you can throw more light on it. So I'm not a Ghanaian actually, but for the past 2 years, I've been spending my life between Ghana and Kenya. Now we are talking about galamsey, and I think galamsey has gotten the attention of many Ghanaians and beyond. Only when galamsey has become really worse in the country, so it has escalated to the point now, or everybody's talking about it. So now we are trying to fight galamsey. While we are trying to fight galamsey, how can we also take precautions or also create awareness about other threats to our environment? You also mentioned earlier in the presentation about air pollution, because I think as much as we expect government to, solve problems when they escalated, I think we also have a role to play to prevent, from getting to these problems. You get what I mean? He also said just now that our leaders are the problem, but there are also keys growing up today. There are also future leaders. You get, so how can we also prevent them, give them the right education to also make sure there are precautions taken, not only galamsey but other threats to the environment. That's my question.
Ken, because I think Daryl's already covered those points, can we come back to that later? Is that okay?
All right, that would be great.
Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you. So Tenielle is our next contributor. So Daryl kind of touched on some of those Chinese or international influences on the topic that we are discussing. And that's Tenielle's line of expertise. So Tenielle, do you want to introduce yourself quickly again, just for those who joined later, and then we can get into the questions?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Tenielle Ellis. I'm originally from Honolulu, Hawaii. I just graduated with a dual master's degree. I did 1 year at Columbia University in New York, studying international relations, and I am currently in Berlin, Germany. I did my 2nd year here in public policy. I've traveled a lot around West Africa, Senegal, Gambia, Ghana, as well as I lived in China for 3 years. So I kind of bridged my experiences living in those countries, studying in those countries, and specialize in China-Africa relations, specifically in sustainable investment ethics and how that affects local management. And we will discuss everything. I think the discussion that we just had was very important, and I will go into depth into more of foreign investment, how the Chinese play a role in this, later on. So
Fabulous.
yeah.
Okay. I think just to on the flyer it says Sino-Africa relations. Can you just quickly define what that means, just so we're all on the same page?
Yes, so basically, I'm specializing more in China-Africa relations, Sino-Africa relations, basically China's relations or Asian relations into the African continent. Various countries have different governments, whether that's democracies, republics, Islamic republics, so the relations differ. And this could mean relations economically, politically, socially. So we'll get into all of those various facets when we talk about China's role.
Okay, so the first question that I had was, in your view or from your experience, what role does these China-Africa relationships have on things like galamsey, but also kind of other environmental crises in Ghana or on the continent in general?
Yes, thank you for this question. So first, I want to set the precedent of Sino-Africa relations and really where this stemmed from the trade relations, which was in the late 1950s. And it progressed to 2013, where the Chinese President Xi Jinping executed this strategic global initiative called the One Road, One Belt Initiative, or the BRI. I'm going to be referring to this abbreviation a lot throughout our discussion, so please keep that in note, BRI. And basically, this initiative is not only China doesn't only want to help foster economic growth, targeting lower income countries, but they also want to build railroads that connects a whole bunch of countries around the continent, as well as maritime trade and routes. So a lot of these initiatives, what comes with this is Chinese investments into African infrastructures. And you see a lot of that happening in various countries, not only in Africa, but in the Middle East, in other parts of Southern Asia. And so when it comes to illegal mining or things like galamsey, you can also see a lot of small scale mining operations happening or linking to galamsey activities. And a lot of times, because these activities lack legal frameworks or structural frameworks, a lot of Chinese businesses will exploit these gaps, and they will operate without taking accountability for in the environmental impacts or how that affects the local people on the ground. So we're really looking at weak regulatory frameworks that is, yes, as Daryl brought out, is from the government that needs to be worked on. Because if the government isn't even establishing stronger regulatory frameworks around environmental concern, then how do you expect foreign powers to come in and respect that as well? However, there is a lot of good potential in this as well, where China can bring forth a lot of resources with their advanced technology and their investments. However, they have decided not to utilize their skill set to help Ghana or various African countries, to help them in the long term. And that's with the economy and everything. So we will get into more of that throughout our conversation.
So in your view, what are the long-term social and economic implications of China's growing influence in Africa and Ghana?
it is very unfortunate because there is so much potential for China to be used as an actor or a partner in this sense with a lot of African countries to help foster their economic growth in the long term. But unfortunately, they took the latter, and it is more of a lender-borrower situation where the relationship between China and a lot of African countries are not equal. It's not mutually beneficial. It's more of a, you have something or I have something that you need, and so these are the conditionalities, these are the clauses. If you are not abiding by these conditionalities, and this is what we are going to impose, which could be like a lot of different factories being built there, or I'm going to deploy my team of Chinese construction workers instead of looking at who's on the ground and using the local skill set. So in the long term, this could actually, this already has very negative and drastic effects to many African countries, one of them being Kenya, which is the #1 leading country in Africa, which is plummeted in debt to China. And Ghana, from what I last checked from last year in October, owes about $2 billion to China. So with all that being said, we can already see the statistics and the numbers. And you can already see that the long-term impacts of China's investments into these infrastructures do not necessarily help them in the long run. In the short run, when you're giving out $1 million loan for 5% interest, this is just an example, then this could be a very attractive deal. But when you're not looking at the clauses or the conditionalities that they've imposed, when there's no legal frameworks to these contracts, then this is when a lot of the local governments are not looking at any of these conditionalities. And a lot of times the leaders themselves also benefit from these negotiations because they get a really big percentage and share of what the Chinese is offering them. So they're not looking at their national interests, and they're not looking at long-term economic yields, which is very important when we're talking about negotiating with the Chinese. There's also a lot of social implications. So like I was just saying, Chinese companies prioritize importing their labor, and this sidelines a lot of local workers. And this can fuel a lot of tensions between Chinese workers and local workers. And also, when we talk about the media, a lot of the media tends to overlook a lot of these issues and problems of China's true and real impact into Africa. They tend to glorify how China is donating all of this money or helping to foster the economic growth of these African countries, but the media is not really publicizing and not being transparent as to what goes on in these negotiation tables, what happens, what are the discussions, what are the dialogues, what is exactly being agreed on. You don't see a lot of those in the media, and China does that on purpose to kind of further their propaganda that they're the ones that are helping Africa get out of poverty and helping them with their infrastructure development and helping them with their education spheres. So these issues that I'm talking about are not really highlighted in the media.
Woo! I'm loving how all everybody's points is like linking together. So Edem, coming to you about the media. That is fab. I can see some brewing questions already. So we're going to quickly go over the last couple questions.
Sure.
I'm going to do 2 questions from the audience, and then we'll move on to Edem, and then we'll do the rest of the questions after. Sure. So my question is, how can African countries, how do you think they can ensure fair and sustainable partnerships in these relations?
Yes, so the heart of this is local governments adopting, so to say, proactive strategies in negotiations, not so much, I'm going to go to the negotiation table because I need $1 billion to build my mining factory, and I'm just going to deal with the consequences later. No, you need to hire skilled laborers, you need to hire consultants, hire negotiators, bring the African Union to the table, bring there are so many resources that the government can use to help them prepare for negotiating when it comes to this. And this is extremely important. It sets the precedent for how the Chinese will, quote unquote, respect the local governments and what they want. So for instance, like building skilled teams of negotiators to advocate for fairer terms in contract with the Chinese, And this is a really key point that a lot of people in the audience were saying. Daryl touched up upon this, but transparency, accountability, and I'm going to add one more thing, accuracy. The accuracy of the knowledge that is being broadcasted. So like I was saying before, publicizing agreements to ensure transparency, establishing like monitoring bodies to oversee project implementation of Chinese businesses to make sure that there's fairer management going on, and not just the Chinese coming in and taking over and restricting local management. We can also focus on sustainability, looking at like impact assessments. So there's so many things that are missing here when it comes to China being involved in investing in a lot of African infrastructures. And another thing I wanted to bring out is I believe that throughout my research that a lot of local governments need to start looking at diversifying their partnerships when it comes to the global market. China is Africa's largest trading partner. And when you look at that, that makes the market very niche and very exclusive. And this emphasizes or shows a relationship that can be extremely toxic because it starts to become dependency debt, where a lot of African countries are dependent on China in order to thrive, in order to establish their infrastructures. So this is very important for China to also, for Africa to also look at different partners. However, this all also does center back and come back to them fostering their own, their local workers, like investing more in education and vocational training, so that you can keep skilled workers in places like Ghana, throughout the continent, instead of them having to leave to find other jobs because there's better pay, there's better incentives. Like, this is what the government needs to be looking at to keep skilled workers in their country. And this would thus, like in the long term, really help the growth trajectory of the economy, the local economy. So yes, I think I touched on a lot of things with the fourth question as well.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, I'll ask it anyway. So what role should African governments play in regulating Chinese businesses? Now that I asked you that question, that sounds more like a legal thing, but I'll ask it anyway. What role should African governments play in regulating Chinese business to protect the environment and the local economies and communities?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. They have a very, very crucial role. They need to enforce better policies, foreign policies, when it comes to global trade in general. China, we are looking at China because it is their number one partner. But when you look at it in general, they lack a lot of legal frameworks, structured legal frameworks when it comes to what they bring to the negotiation table, and what are they asking for. So there needs to be a lot of development with stricter environmental regulations, if I'm going to touch upon that as well, tailored to sectors where Chinese businesses operate, like Galamsey, and to also penalize non-compliant companies. And when I talk about these penalties, that can be utilized in different ways, because there's, like, in Islamic republics versus democracies or different governments, they can use that in their own way. You can also mandate local hiring quotas and training programs in Chinese operated businesses. And this is from the grassroots, of using what you already have to inform and educate the Chinese that are coming in, and to also support local suppliers and businesses. So there's so many things that need to be done. But I think the number one crucial conclusion to all of this is that local governments need to be more prepared when they come to the negotiation table with China. China knows exactly what they're doing with their negotiations with Africa. And I saw a question here that I'm going to talk about now, which is why would China even invest in this? If there's not a lot of, if the relationship is not as mutually beneficial. And this is because China doesn't invest into African infrastructures for money. This is not a business deal for them. This is power for them, control. This is a part of modern day colonialism, neo-colonialism that we see happening right now. If they wanted to do business deals, they would do it with the US, they would do it with the EU, but they choose to target and exploit a lot of African infrastructures and governments because they know there's a gap there. They know that there's a need that needs to be filled, and they're the ones that are going to try to fulfill it. But that in long term exacerbates a lot of the economic downfall of these local African governments. So I think I said
Woo! I'm loving this, and it's getting heated in the chat.
I love it. I love it. Yes.
Loving it.
I mean, I don't love it. This is not...
event on its own.
Yes.
I'm going to come back to a lot of those comments in a bit. So we're going to do Buntri, and then we're going to do Ira, and then we're going to move on to Edem, just to kind of get all the points out there, and then we can really begin to hit some of these things. So Buntri.
Good evening again. Thank you also for your contributions. I'll try to keep my my question brief this time, Madam Ellis. To say, you mentioned about China, you know, here in Ghana since the 50s. It actually goes way back. There's a lot of proof of China in Nigeria, the Edo State area, Cameroon, and so forth. But let's just focus on, you know, 20th century and this century. I wanted to ask, how important is it to you, do you feel, that there'd be a sort of like an ideological analysis of China in Africa in the 50s, under those, you know, that era of independence leaders, as compared to China today with our neo-colonial neoliberalism? How important do you think it is that there be, you could call it a separate, but just an ideological analysis to see, if any, what the differences in motivation and political orientation is between the two eras, the two generations of Maoist Chinese and Jinping Chinese, so forth. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I think you answered your own question. That was a great question into your explanation. You summed it up really well. Yes, with the Maoist era, and excuse me, from what I said, the late 1950s, I just meant that was when they conducted majority of global trade within various African countries. I wasn't just touching upon Ghana. But yes, the relationship goes back much further. And I would definitely say there needs to be an analysis. I don't know why there hasn't been. If you look at a lot of economist reports, they do mention analysis is like these, but where they differ in a lot of economists' like perspective is in the Maoist era versus now with the Xi Jinping era, it's extremely different. There's a lot of similarities with you can say like communism in the Maoist era, and now there's, I would say, modern day communism with China. And you can see how back then China was still trying to establish themselves as a global power. So their motives were much different when it came to collaborating. They did not want to open up their networks to the globe, if I'm just going to be frank. China in Chinese, 中国 literally translates to the middle country, like the country that's in the center of the world. So that's how they viewed themselves. And I feel like there would be actually like way more differences in that comparative analysis from then and now than similarities. So that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think that is necessary.
Thank you. Ira, you had a question?
Okay, right. I was saying that I always find it problematic when we posit Africans as victims and we sort of like have external people coming in with solutions. And sometimes actually, I think a lot of the reports that come out about from the, I don't know, world, whatever, and this person, that person, it's not actually accurate, because when you talk to the locals, it's a completely different kind of stuff going on the ground level to what we're reading about, to what we're hearing about. And I honestly think that the solutions have to come from the Africans who live there, who've grown up there, who know the culture and the language, and we kind of like work hand in hand to support if need be. And the other thing I was saying as well was like, The other problem that I have is that I think the Chinese are just looking out for their own interests. And quite frankly, I think that Western governments have done worse than what the Chinese have done. And I think that it is up to the Africans to come up with a plan that works for them when they're doing, when they're making these deals with external governments and so on and so forth. And they choose, in my opinion, like the lady has just said, they choose to do something else. They choose to do what benefits them all across the board, as we consistently see with everything they're doing. It's about self. So that's the only point I wanted to make. And then I was having a discussion in the chat, because I was saying, well, what's happened to Ghana and other African countries when we've got countries like Malaysia who also got their independence? Because I find Ghanaians are very defensive and they come up with excuses like, oh, well, we're a new country and this, that, and the other. I don't buy it. Again, it's a victim thing. And I think that if you want to do something, you want to make it work, you will find a way. If you don't want to, you will remain a victim. And I'm very hardcore about it. And I'm really sorry. I hope I don't offend anyone, but that's just my opinion. And that's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't have to apologize. Pretty much everything you're saying is the whole reason why we're having this conversation, is the whole reason why I put together the research center, and I'm going to talk all about all of that in a bit, but that's pretty much the whole thing, right? I don't blame China for looking out for their own interests, right? That's what they should do. Our problem is that we don't do that. And it's funny, there was a discussion that's happening in London at the moment, because every year they put out this song, the Do They Know It's Christmas Time at All, that song. And FuseODG sort of did this post, kind of gone viral, talking about how the BBC always positions Africa as this poor country, blah, 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 blah. And it's a discussion that we've been having for as long as I can remember. And my position is that I'm tired of the discussion. I just don't care. Because why are we so concerned about how the BBC is portraying Africa? We're saying, the BBC wants to portray Africa as broke and poor and all that kind of stuff. That's their platform. Do I agree? Of course not. But the reality is, the relationships that our leaders have with these Western leaders is one of begging and poverty, right? So even when they went to COP29, the president was talking about, these are all the things that we've put in place, but we need more money because we're a third world country. Like, that's basically how they are positioning themselves, and we allow these people to represent us in this way. And for me, I'm very much like, how can we, as in like actual people who are invested in this, work with locals to find those solutions? But I'm going to touch on all of that in a bit, because that's kind of what we're doing as a centre, and the whole point of the initiative, because actually we can't keep expecting other people to solve these problems. Okay, Kukwa, do you want to ask your question?
Excellent. Thank you so much for your presentation, Daryl and Tenielle and Edem. I'm really excited about your presentation. And Andrea, thank you for this opportunity. So my question is more of a, I guess, a comment and a question. My question would be just to understand more of what can be done. And it's stemming from the fact that I feel these conversations can get very quickly anti-Black. Again, I'm not pointing fingers. This is coming from my almost 2 decades, working in Ghana. I literally just moved out of Ghana recently. My job has been with persons that are indigent. And so I don't think that the most economically challenged Ghanaians point fingers for where they are, at least from my interaction with those persons. And even looking at my grandparents that are an example, I think that the reason why I'm asking what can be done is because I'm really concerned when I look at the statistics for the percentages African countries get from whatever they produce. So thank you so much, Daryl, for bringing up the issue of the cocoa farming, for example, and the issue currently with the minerals leaking. I think today I found out the percentage was like 6% that Ghana gets from cocoa. I don't know what we get from gold, but I feel that there are these structural issues that define what is going on. If we are using 90% of our money to service, not even to pay, but to service debt that we have, what room is there for African countries then to be able to get any money to develop? And I'm also bringing this up to say that within that sphere, this whole idea, Nelson Mandela said that poverty is artificial, like apartheid, and slavery and all the other things. The artificial, creations. It doesn't make sense that there's so much wealth and yet people are impoverished. And when you trace back, it's literally going to the situation where African countries have minimal proportions in what they are creating. So it's why it brings me back to what can be done. Again, I really love the discussions on the solutions that are coming from Africans. And so that's why I'm very happy that Daryl and Tenielle, spoke about that. And I think Edem will as well. So thank you so much for taking my perspective and just having this. This is also fabulous.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Very encouraging. Yeah, was there a question in there? Did I miss the question?
I think the question was what can be, it was still going back to what can be done, but
okay, yeah, so that's the overall question. So we're going to come back to that. Hello, Edem, my fellow activist. I love Edem, guys. So this is Edem. Can you also, in the same way, introduce yourself for those who have joined, and then we'll get into the questions.
Okay. So my name is Edem. I am from Ghana, but currently doing my PhD in Canada, in the film and media department. My PhD really is looking at how marginalized people can use alternative media for activism. And I was looking before specifically at documentary filmmaking, but if there's anything that I've learned in graduate school is that your project can change, it keeps changing. If it's not changing, it means that you're not learning and you're not interacting with the things that you're coming in contact with. So it's an ever-changing project. Right now, I'm looking at specifically alternative media. And when I say alternative media, I'm looking at anything that's not mainstream or anything that's not legacy media. So a lot of it is very dependent on the internet. So that's really it. My master's thesis was on feminist documentary filmmaking in Ghana and how Ghanaian feminists have used documentary filmmaking for activism or to sort of initiate some conversations or social change. So I looked specifically at The Witches of Gambaga. If you haven't seen it, please go look for it. It's on YouTube. And I also looked at a very recent film, When Women Speak. So really I guess my field is media communications activism. I have to say that I also work with Fix the Country in different capacities. So when the 53 people who went to protest, a lot of them are my friends, got arrested. Myself, Andrea, and Tessa were sort of running things. So we were the ones running things in their absence. So that's kind of my background, really, and that's just who I am.
And she's a fabulous person. Thank you very much. So yes, we're going to talk about the role of media and activism.
Yeah.
So again, I sent you a couple of questions. We're going to touch on those questions. I do have a couple of cheeky questions that I'm going to try and slide in there, but let's see how it goes.
Okay.
So the first question is, how do you think the media coverage has influenced public perception and action regarding issues such as galamsey, but also just kind of social issues? So like for example, when everyone was arrested, and all of those things, how do you think what role do you think the media is playing in educating the public about these issues?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question. I think I'm gonna go on and on. If I'm going off topic, please bring me back. I tend to do that a lot. But I think that we all as a people understand the role of the media in sustaining a democracy and in the distribution of information, and that's why to a large extent we have actually come to call the media the fourth estate of the realm, to say that it's the sort of a fourth arm of government, to sort of cement its role in sustaining a democracy. And they have been sorry, I'm looking at the screen and seeing the questions, so I'm like a bit distracted, but that's fine. I will look at it later. But as I was saying, the media is very instrumental in every society, and that's why when coups happen, one of the first things that they do is to go, sort of seize the media, and that's how they broadcast that, okay, we're in charge now. It's that powerful. When it comes to how they shape the things that we think about as a society, or even the way that we interact with each other, I think that we cannot also dispute that. That is going specifically to I'm always going back to queer rights, because that's also one of the things that I study. There's been numerous studies that says that the media has sort of been a huge part of invoking a moral panic. So they are very good at getting people or the entire society to think that, oh, something terrible is going to happen, and then everybody's up in arms. When it comes, however, to activism of this kind, the media seems to be lagging, or not doing a lot of what they are supposed to. We want them to do. So, for example, when it came to the arrest of the 53 people, I don't live in Ghana, but I'm constantly talking to my siblings, and one of the things that my sister said to me is that the media, for example, was reporting it as if it was thugs, that were sort of just on the street, uncontrollable, blocking the street, and then that report on how do you call it? People losing their lives because they could not access the 37 hospital. I think a part of it is because, like every aspect of our society, from Galamsey to whatever it is, the media space has now been in Ghana has now come to be dominated by politicians. Okay, so they get the number of licenses that had been issued to politicians in the last couple of years is mind-boggling. So they get the money, their party is in power, they get the license, they open radio stations and all of that. So of course, if you're affiliated to a political party, a lot of the things that you're going to say is going to be either supportive of your political party, or if you're not in power, then it's going to criticize the party that is in power. So that has been some of the ways that, and even the ways that, monitoring from here, the headlines, the way that they frame the story. So they say democracy had protesters. If you say democracy had protesters, you're saying a group, it almost feels like a group of people or an organization that is doing this protest. Meanwhile, it's well-meaning Ghanaians that are hitting the streets to say that, you know what, we're tired of this Galamsey thing. It's destroying our water bodies. Is babies are being born with deformities, our food and everything. And but then you frame it as democracy had protesters, and it's almost as if it's fitting into this narrative of thugs or a group of unruly people coming on the street to protest, right? And so this has been some of the ways that the media sort of has been framing some of the conversations around how do you call it, advocacy for you know, an end to galamsey and all of these things, and other social issues, I have to say.
Yeah, I think that you touched on, oh my God, so many key points there. The misinformation that tends to come from the media in some ways, or even the lack of information. So as Edem said, we are both part of Fix the Country, and one of the things is that it's almost like they come to us for information and then choose and then edit that information to then put out to the public. There isn't necessarily a there isn't a due diligence that's applied.
I did, now that you mentioned that, I did want to also touch on the way that it's structured. Some of it is that journalists are overworked and underpaid, right? There's no job. You know, I used to work in a media house, and I don't want to go into the details of that, but you're overworked, you can be called to come to work at any point, at any time, and you are expected to deliver. And this is not me making an excuse for a journalist, because I think that, as you know, if you sign up to be a journalist, it's like signing up to be a doctor. When there's an emergency and you are needed, you should go, but it doesn't mean you should not do your job. But then it adds to this thing of, I don't know if you know about armchair journalists, where they don't necessarily go out to investigate anything. It's just sitting at the office, there's a phone. Oh, I have this person's contact, and just calling the person and saying, and asking them one or two questions and writing the story based on what the person has said. And so you realize that even in the news that we consume, there's except a few people like Eras, who recently was doing a galamsey documentary but was even beaten up, except for a few people who go on the grounds and do groundwork. And this is also a problem because how do you call it? Media houses are not investing as much in correspondence. So everything is centralized, based in Accra, as if everything is happening in Accra, but then they're not investing in correspondent as much as they are investing in their, you know, the people that they work with in Accra to go and do groundwork. A lot of our media is, or the conversations of the media or the news is based on this person said, that person said, and that's the end of it. So the police releases as arrests. We saw that last year when the BBC journalist got arrested, for example, and the police said, oh, we did not arrest any journalist. And then they reported, only for the journalist himself to come out to say that I was arrested and I was assaulted, you know. So they're not doing very much besides sitting somewhere and going to and calling people to report. Beyond that, also, our news is dominated by event, going to event, covering the event and reporting, because it's like, you know, it goes back to journalists being underpaid. Okay, because there's something, I don't know how many of you have heard about Sole and solidarity. So the more events you can go to as a journalist. So usually when you go for event organizers usually put money in envelopes and hand it over to the journalists, right? So the more events you're able to, so if you're an underpaid journalist, for example, the more events you go to and report on it, the more money you get, because you're going to, say you're going for 10 events in a week, and every event organizer is giving you 100 cedis. That's 1,000 cedis. Correct me if I'm wrong, because my math can be terrible, but that's 1,000 cedis in a week, right? So you're motivated to do more of that work rather than doing work that is necessarily impactful, that contributes the way that it should to the democracy. Beyond that, going back to the first point that I mentioned about politicians acquiring media houses, a lot of, well, let me not say a lot of, but we have some influential journalists who also have politicians as godfathers. Okay, so in that case, you know, if your party is in power or whatever, and also they don't necessarily, they don't want to offend politicians because everybody is checking my pocket. What if this politician, the closer I get to this person, or even sometimes it's not even about how, it's not even about money, it's also about access and money, right? So if every Ghanaian, if you go to, if there are issues with a hospital, so that if I got sick and I couldn't get a bed to be treated, maybe if I'm close to a politician, if I went to the hospital and would call the politician, they'll be able to treat me, right? So there are all these issues that is sort of preventing a journalist from sort of doing the work that they're actually supposed to do. And I think it goes back to the baseline of structures, resources, that are, unavailable. And when it comes, I know there's a question about misinformation and disinformation. I don't know if you want to ask me that, or I don't know if you want me to just go ahead and respond to that question.
Yeah, do you know what? You've given me a term. I'm going to use this term now. I feel like what a common theme across what's come up so far, I'm going to call it weaponized poverty. There seems to be this trait, or what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the right word, but there seems to be this thing where if we keep people at a general low level of income and general, like just on the cusp of poverty, then we can kind of control what they do. And even it kind of spiraling into journalism and media is quite interesting. What was the question that you wanted to address?
The question about disinformation and misinformation.
Yeah, let's come back to that one, because I think I want to combine that with the legal aspect. So we'll come back to that. Sorry, I've just lost my page. Yes, so the other question, so we're looking at it from the media and now activism. So what challenges do you think activists face when trying to engage in advocacy, and do you have any ideas on how we can overcome?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Sorry, what challenges are activists facing when it comes to trying to engage in advocacy, and what do you think can be done about them? I mean, I think that what do you think can be done about it is probably more of an open question, but give us an insight into some of the challenges that are being faced by activists.
I think, I don't know if you have, I don't know how many of you have followed. I was looking into the chat box. There are so many questions for me. I hope I'm able to respond to some of them. But I don't know how many of you followed the recent arrest of the 53 persons. I know Tessa is on this call, and Andrew, there's you. So we probably know some of the things beyond, what has been shared on social media. But there's a lot of cost involved, and I'm actually thinking about this for part of my thesis, which was not originally part, but to be honest about the cost of activism to people who are activists, and not just them, but even their loved ones, friends, families, because part of it is also mental, right? For the 53 people who were arrested that we've had to deal with, for example, there's been job losses because they were behind bars for 3 weeks. And, the state doesn't feed you when you are in police custody. And so we found out where people were, because the police also refused to tell us where people were. And then when we found where people were, they changed their locations. So we're constantly trying to figure out where people were, and found out where people were after 10 days. So it means they had not eaten in that 10 days, not to talk about the physical assaults that they suffer in the hands of the police. So we saw, for example, that Oliver, for example, had been brutalized. He wasn't the only one that had been brutalized. Even in the cells, people who have been taken in police custody who are also in the cells brutalize people who are brought in, you know. So there are all of these things that happen. But there's also you know, when you lose your job, you're also losing your source of income. So if you're a breadwinner, then it's worse. Beyond that, there's also the risk of actually not being employed, because when people find that you do this kind of work, well, maybe you're going to be arrested again and be gone for 2 weeks or something like that. But also people don't want to generally offend politicians, right? So if you're affiliated with this group and you're working with us, then there's that conflict. And I think one of the things that we always talk about, the tangibles, you know, loss of jobs and all of that. But one of the things that we may not necessarily be paying attention to is mental health. I was not arrested, but having to do this work while all of the people had been detained took a huge toll on my mental health that I am still recovering from up until till now. So like sometimes I go off and I know it's related to having to do this work long term, like deprived sleep, because I'm in a different time zone from Ghana. I'm 4 hours now, 5 hours behind. So by the time we have all the conversations for the day and say, okay, we're done for the day and I will be going to bed, that's when Ghana is waking up, you know, and then my phone is buzzing or my phone is ringing. So you're not having enough sleep, and it does affect your mental health. You know, the stories that you know, colleagues have shared with us, you know, people that we've had to send, low income households, and that we've had to fundraise and send monies to and all of that. It takes the stories that you hear, you know, it takes a toll on you. You might not know it in the moment, but then when things simmer down a bit, it hits you that you've been going nonstop for all this while. And I don't know if I'm allowed to disclose this, but you know, even within ourselves, we have a platform that we organize on. It's like, since this everybody sort of is on edge, right? The slightest thing people get upset. And we may not have talked about it that way, but I think it's related to the trauma that we, so that's me who was not arrested. So imagine the people who got arrested and had to spend that number of time, amount of time and number of days in police custody without knowing if somebody was coming for them or if you know, they were going to make any progress with this case, right? So these are some of the costs that's associated with, you know, activism, and this is the people that are actively involved in the activism. Think about their loved ones, you know, not hearing from, you know, maybe, you know, your partner or your sibling for a number of days and not knowing where they are. If they are usually people who are you are constantly talking to, you know. Imagine for the man Emmanuel, who was not necessarily a protester, but who had been picked up by the police anyways, and whose wife had just given birth, you know, in the hospital. It's a lot for not only just the people that are involved, but you know, also their close ties and associations. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very, very key points there. That those 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks was insane. And
It was more than 4 weeks.
I'm in the UK, and I felt for Edem and her time zone. But even with me, so like I said, my daughter's only 5 months old. And when my mum was here, it was much easier to kind of try and coordinate things, because obviously my daughter has what she needs. But when my mum wasn't here, trying to organize certain things, I almost felt like I was neglecting my daughter for like that whole time. And it makes me quite emotional when I talk about it, because if you know me, I'm very passionate about child development and all of those things. And that's where my expertise lies. So it's almost like having my daughter laying in the bed next to me, and she's sort of, you know, like, I'm feeding her and everything else, don't get me wrong, but not being able to interact with her the way that I would normally, because we're dealing with this issue, and then we find out that actually so and so and so has been moved to this this jail,
Yeah.
and he's told us, and these people have been split up, and then all of a sudden there's like a whole other person that we didn't even know had been arrested like 4 days later, and therefore they haven't been fed for 4 days. But again, we're not even experiencing these things. So, you know, we're like the coordinators, not even in the country, right, in the background. And it is quite taxing. And I think it's quite frustrating also because people then say, oh, you know, you guys are just collecting money from this political party or this opposition party. And I can tell you for free, no one ain't giving me no money. So yeah,
Oh
it's very,
there's so many questions for me that I'm tempted
I know, I'm coming. So let's do the other 2 questions, and then you can pick 2 questions, and then we're going to go to Oliver, and then we'll come back and have the broad discussion because, yeah. Okay, so I mean, this question, I guess, is actually similar to one of the questions that's in the chat, which is how can media outlets counteract misinformation and gain control over the narrative?
I think, you know, sometimes I think it's simple because we should know, but then so you see, I think we need to do due diligence, you know, and put emphasis on fact, okay, rather than speed, especially in this day and age of social media and, you know, monetized social media platforms of media organizations and all of that. I think it all contributes. Who's first to break the news and not necessarily who has in fact gone behind, you know, face value to do a bit more digging to ensure that is this factual, is what we're publishing factual. I think that in the past, that sort of used to be the case, I would like to say. I could be naive, but in this day and age, because of the number of views, or you know, the number of people going onto my site who broke the news first and all of that, we're not exactly doing due diligence because we want to be the first to break it. And when you emphasize speed rather than fact checking and all of that, you leave a lot of room for errors, you know. So I think one of the things we should be doing is to put emphasis on getting fact checking and doing multiple fact checking. Again, in this day and age of misinformation, you're a media house, you're a journalist, you're not a blog, even bloggers, you know, you're not just a blogger or something like that, or you're not a social media influencer or something of that sort. I'm not saying this to exonerate social media influencers or all of that, but there's a reason that you're called a journalist and not a social media influencer, right? Because you're supposed to go beyond what everybody is seeing or what everybody is reporting, because there's been numerous accounts of people saying A, journalists saying A, when it's B, and they come back later to say, oh, it's B, but then people have already run with with point A, you know. So I think that that's something to look at. We should also, media houses should also be looking at having fact checkers, you know, like people who are actual because these days people are trained in fact checking, you know, people who are actual fact checkers to work with them in the media houses, so that's not just journalism reporting, but then you actually also have people who have these skills, who can actually do whatever tools they have available to them to do the fact checking. So I think these are I think fact checking, and emphasis on not speed, but rather getting it right. Do you see what I mean? Yeah.
Fabulous. Okay. So my last question, which I think we can maybe skip it because I know you're eager to answer some of those questions. Or should we?
What's the last question? Maybe we should.
Can you share examples where media-driven activism has successfully led to tangible change?
Oh, so I think that, with in Ghana, I have an example of, and I would not say just the media, but the media and the upper middle class people in society, because like there are numerous examples from all over the world when there's been a team up and things have worked. So with the Arab Spring, for example, we talk about in this context we talk about protests that have happened in China, for example, the umbrella movement, where a lot of it was also because the middle class, played a significant role. So all these protests may have initially been started by lower class people in the lower class, but then as soon as the middle upper class people add their voices to it, then it becomes this huge thing that the people in power cannot necessarily ignore, right? And these voices have been also been amplified by the media. In the Ghanaian context, for example, before this new wave of Stop Galamsey Now, in 2017 there was a media coalition for media coalition against Galamsey that was formed, that I think was spearheaded by City FM, and they did this. I would like to call it a protest, because there was a protest against illegal mining, and that was led by the media. So you see the media aggressively reporting on on Galamsey, making posters and flyers, distributing it in traffic. Like, they did a lot of work. And what we saw, Daryl, please correct me if I'm wrong, but there were moments in time when the government actually responded, and there were times, I think there was a ban on Galamsey for a certain period of time. And then once the media took their eyes off of that, then it's like, oh, now we have a chance to do whatever we want, because the media is not watching anymore, right? There's a reason they're called a watchdog, because once they have their eyes on something, then it means that they're not taking their eyes off people. The people in power are forced to act. I remember, there's also this incident of when the how do you call it? A journalist was assaulted by a known supporter of the ruling government. And what media houses did and journalists did is that if you don't apologize, I think they laid out a couple of things for the party to do. If you don't do A, B, C, and D, we're not reporting on you anymore. And immediately they came to apologize. So there are examples of the media saying that, putting their foot on the ground and saying that if you don't do this, then we're also not going to do this. And then you know that these people in power know that they also need the media, right? So I think that the media has to there has to be this relationship. Someone just put in the comment, Haja Fatih and Techua of Adom FM. That's that case. So we need to work, and this is me responding to a question about civil society or something like that in the comment. We need to work together as a people. And I guess this is where the diasporan aspect comes in. When the 53 got, I'm going back to the 53 because it's a very recent example. When people are we are in the diaspora, the people on the ground, how can we work together along with the media, but then also people of every class to get things done? There's actually also an example of Drop That Chamber, when Ghana's parliament, in the midst of all these economic crises, decided that they had money to build a bigger parliamentary space. It was the should I say middle and upper class Ghanaians that came together wrote a petition, did a social media protest, and eventually Parliament decided that because if you have, oftentimes, if it's just the lower class that's agitated about something, they don't care, right? But then if you have people from the middle and the upper class saying, as for this one, yeah, no, then they sit up.
Hi, I just want to apologize for the abrupt transition between our two speakers. So Edem, who you've just heard, and Oliver, who's our next speaker. We had some, let's call them technical difficulties. So my apologies for that. And the next voice that you'll be hearing will be Oliver's.
I'm a lawyer in Ghana, and I don't know what else. I guess that's it. I'm interested and I'm happy to be joining this conversation here today. Okay.
I mean, I feel like I'm a lawyer in Ghana doesn't really like cut.
Oh, well, I'm a lawyer everywhere else. Wherever I find myself, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
No, but yeah, I'm definitely interested in some of the themes that we're exploring in this conversation. I think hopefully I can also offer some perspectives on them. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So yes, Oliver says he's a lawyer. He has many things. Right. So yes, we've invited Oliver here, and Oliver's also one of the founding members of NORI, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. And I invited Oliver because for me, the core of actually addressing a lot of these issues come down to so that like the issues that we're facing, a lot of it comes down to the legal and the constitution, and I do not have necessarily the knowledge and expertise in that department. So if we invited Oliver here for those things. So again, I sent Oliver some pre-questions to kind of start off the discussion, and then we will kind of open up the discussion. So the first question is, what are the key legal challenges hindering progress in addressing social, economic, and environmental issues in Ghana?
Yeah. So first of all, let me say that sort of my appreciation and understanding of what law is can be a bit different from the way in which many people interact with it. And I think that the conversation about the legal framework and the way in which it limits or impedes socioeconomic justice requires a bigger reflection on the structure of power and the way in which our social institutions have been set up. Because we ought to remind ourselves that law in this case is not only just legal instruments that we know, but the structure of our society as we understand it is also very law-based. So whether or not in terms of how communities are set up with chiefs and chieftaincy institutions and things like that, those derive out of law. The way in which we relate to the public sphere, the way in which we relate to elected officials, the idea that we have elections in themselves are also products of law more generally. So to think about the persistence of social inequality is to have a more broader view in terms of the basic structure of our society itself is the one we need to question as to whether or not we have designed our social institutions in the way that make it almost impossible for social inequality or economic inequality or some of those problems to continue to thrive. And I don't think that we have. One of the things as well is that even beyond not having been able to create society in a way that enhances our efforts to reduce economic and social inequality, and also the way in which it impedes us from being able to reach some of the goals we claim to set for ourselves, also requires us to reflect more deeply on whether or not law amplifies our attempts to be able to solve the social problems and some of the issues that exist. Now, to say that law structures our society is also to think about our society's relationship with our constitutional framework more generally. And so you can take every issue, right? Let me take from some of the most prominent conversations we have been having around environmental and things like that, and you can reflect from the constitutional perspective. And one of the things our Constitution does so well is being able to give us more broader principles and general aphorisms or words that claim to give us a sense that, oh, this is what our society values. But what it is immediately disables us from is that it doesn't provide a real framework for us to be able to live up to those principles or things that it claims to believe in, or things that it sets as our social values. So one, for instance, the Constitution says that sort of the environment and resources are things that are held in trust, one, for future generations when you think about the environment, and two, in terms of our resources that exist, that it says that they are held in trust for we Ghanaians as it exists. So the question is, what is the nature of that trust? And if we are beneficiaries of a trust that exists, what is our ability as beneficiaries of a trust to be able to influence the way in which the trust is managed or set up? So it sounds well fanciful to say that, oh, like all mineral and natural resources that exist in the country are held in trust for the people of Ghana by the president. But it's unclear to us where there's a mismanagement by the trustee of that trust. What role does the beneficiaries play in managing or that trust resources? Now, the first thing is that there is no framework that exists for us now to say that we disagree in the way in which the management of that trust is set up. Okay, so we can't say in anywhere that we don't want mineral resources to be mined as beneficiaries of a trust that exists. So the bigger conversations that exist between, broader environmental concerns and the way in which, natural resources exploitation operates, we have no role as beneficiaries of that trust to be involved in the process, as a broader principle. Two, we can't say that the role for us to be able to influence how those who are given licenses and things like that to exploit natural resources, our role and influence in the process is also very limited. And more generally, the grants would happen whether or not we say yes or whether or not we like them. Two, there are no standards that determine how that trust should be managed. Absolutely not. The trustee, through the Attorney General, can then sponsor legislation and says, this is how I want to be able to do it, and the court would uphold it. Because it's assumed that the trustee knows has our best interest at heart, and we just have to shut up and take it as it is. So we can set up we have a legal system which I feel generally does not provide a true mechanism for how we the people can control the decisions that are made on our behalf and how they are made. And so you might take some of the terms that are thrown about more liberally, like, we are custodians of sovereignty, that the sovereignty resides in us, the people. But then what does that mean? Like, what ways in which in our daily governance systems can we seize and exercise that sovereignty? There's no framework for that. So I think the broader question of how you set up society and what you're trying to achieve with it demands a reconfiguration of our entire constitutional setup to make it more aligned to values that we proclaim to believe in. When we say the environment is the legacy or the patrimony of future generations, how do we safeguard that on behalf of future generations? Can a pregnant woman, for instance, say that I have an unborn child which is in vitro, and for which reason I'm coming to enforce future rights or so tomorrow's generation rights in terms of providing and protecting the environment for? It doesn't exist. So if we want to move the document beyond mere rhetoric, it demands that we are more intentional in allowing the people we claim that it serves to have a more direct influence in the processes of things that have supposedly been set up for them. Now, I understand that in terms of how I'm proceeding, again, it can sound a bit, how do you call it? A bit philosophical, for lack of a better word. But I'm hoping that you're staying with me, because I want to challenge you in thinking about the things that we say and take for granted, but that there's really no framework for how we actually actualize some of these things. And I think that's a big problem in itself. Now, in many ways, you expect that, well, you can say that the Constitution cannot provide for everything, and that, you know, subsequent laws that are made in the society and institutions we set up would be able to actualize those principles. But let's remind ourselves that we are, what we have in essence is, we have set up a democracy without Democrats. The people themselves that we have put in place do not believe in the ideal and the values that these things are claiming for themselves. And so if the expectation is that persons who do not believe in that are the ones who are supposed to set it up and its implementation processes, we ought to ask our question that, does the Constitution anticipate that there are going to be people who would come up and will not actualize the words of the Constitution? And in that case, what happens? For instance, the Constitution says immediately after the coming into force of the Constitution, there ought to have been an affirmative action bill passed. Okay, it was passed this year. And the only reason why it was passed this year, after over 30 years, is because it was an IMF conditionality. So those it had placed responsibility on to take lead on it would not do it until a foreign, institution where they're going to seek loan makes it a condition for the loan that they seek. So the accountability of these persons, even to the Constitution itself and to we the people, is non-existent. And when it's non-existent, we have no particular framework to make sure that it comes into reality, more generally. So yeah, I mean, these are introductory kind of reflective thoughts I would have on that, Andrea.
Whew. Okay.
Have I made you
I don't even know where to start. Okay. Okay. While I gather my thoughts on what you've just said, let me move on to the second question. How do you feel like citizens can challenge these constitutional injustice or limitations that effectively limit their rights? I think, let me just ask the question.
Yeah. So, in some way, this question is as well linked to the first, and I'll explain. What mechanisms of challenge does the Constitution provide for we the people, for the citizens in the first place? Okay. So primarily, one of the things that I hear people say often is that you can vote people out. And that's the first mechanism of challenging. But the reasons why people go to the polls, so it's varied and almost unimpeachable, that it's very difficult to be able to tie a direct connection between the absence or the inability to provide certain social goods and how they exercise the franchise. So the vote itself is the most ineffective way of being able to ensure citizens to challenge or to ensure accountability in the first place. Then the second thing is, well, you can go to court, I guess. Okay. Now, that presumes that you're able to find a neutral arbiter in the courts, that it exists. And one of the things I've kind of realized about the ingenuity of the Ghanaian politician is understanding the ease with which the Constitution has created a framework for state capture. And so for all the institutions that have been set up in which you can take your planes to, you've quickly figured out that the way in which we can be able to deal with that, it's one, directly appointing party cronies to all those institutions and filling them up. And with that, quickly enough, you can be able to, neutralize their effects. And secondly, and perhaps the one we don't notice easily, is the reproduction of administrative processes. So when you raise a public issue, let's say police have done something, right? And you can complain about the Ghana police, The first thing people say is that, but have you reported it to the police? Okay. Now, that question does not take into account whether or not the police itself are behind the violence, or that people's lived realities of the police is that they report cases to the police, and the police says, if you don't bring me money, I'm not going to go. But one of the ways in which you can undermine the legitimacy of a complaint you have is that you have not complied with a particular administrative process. And those administrative processes can be repetitive or increase, however you like it. So even if and it's everywhere of our lives, the way in which our institutions function. So even if I went to court and I lost in court and the judge was horrible or took a bribe, the next thing is that, but why didn't you appeal the decision? So there's always something new that you should be able to comply with, which are like meaningless procedures that we keep replicating for you to continue to follow, and we keep following it. But that requires a broader critique of the way in which we set up the administrative state. But the easier thing we have done, and which is more palpable, is the control of those mechanisms for which you can think about entering. And then the third thing is that, well, perhaps you can petition Parliament, the People's Assembly, we call it, right? So immediately once you do that, the Parliament is going to send you a fine letter and say to you that, no, you can't send us a petition. You can give the petition to an MP, and then the MP can bring it before us. So you have no direct input into the process and the way in which Parliament speaks. It has to be laundered through somebody who, whether or not the person takes it, the person is not obliged to take it up, though, as your representative. And if they don't take it up, you have no way to impeach the person who doesn't take it up. Okay. So then ultimately, the only way in which citizens are left to be able to weigh into the political conversation or the challenge you talk about is ultimately what? The streets, protests. But we all know that there's no constitutional or any institutional framework in any country that provides protest as an administrative remedy to a problem you have. It's not, right? Like, for instance, I give this example where if somebody stole something from you, you go to the police as an administrative remedy. So they catch the person. We're supposed to go to court for whatever. But a protest, it leads nothing. There's no promise of anything, and there's no expectation, and nobody is bound to do anything in respect of it. And so you are left with the continuous conversation of, raising public awareness or trying to guilt those you have elected into believing that there's an urgent thing to be addressed here. And I think we can all see the beauty of how politicians can ignore us. And they can ignore everything, including a protest, in many ways. So there are all these strands of things which we think that, this makes us a democracy because these are avenues to be able to build up challenge and power. But the state is set up in a way that minimizes their potential and effect. But it means also, it requires then that we are more creative and more reflective in the ways in which we can be able to sustain and gather public attention and be able to generate mass action on many issues. And we can take the recent, Galamsey conversation as an example, that our ability to sustain and hold conversation on an issue is directly linked to how long the media might stay with us, or how quickly they might follow Afenyo Markin into the Supreme Court, and then we'll be engaged in a conversation for a month over meaningless, whether or not who should be majority and minority in the parliament that is not going to do anything forever. And it has a potential to shift the conversation. And now completely all we've been talking about is who is who and speaker said what, and that's it. There's no productive value, even in the face of an environmental crisis that we are facing. Our ability to be so distracted can be so easily weaponized against us. So there are simple gestures we can do, and those gestures have a limited potential. But it's not always the same in many constitutional democracies. And I give the example of Kenya, where unlike us who cannot initiate a direct constitutional reform action, where, for instance, constitutional reform is reserved to parliament and the executive, in Kenya, citizens can stand up and sign petitions and sign signatures and provoke an amendment referendum immediately, direct action, influencing that process. That, for me, is the opening that ought to happen, and gets back to, reforming the document to be able to open up the avenues for which we can be able to, we as the people can exercise more direct control of our politics. So that's one framework. there's no mechanism to have there's no requirement even for Parliament to be consultative or bring other opinions on board in terms of lawmaking process. Or no law can be invalidated because Parliament did not have enlarged public hearings and sittings before it passed the law. We don't have that. In America, for instance, the courts have held the extent of consultativeness in the process or lack of can be a basis for even invalidating law. But we don't have that. Then also you have the how do I call it? In California, for instance, where we have what we call the recall elections, which is that you have elected a representative to Parliament, and you're like, why has some judge spent his entire time going after the gays? And for which reason we need to recall him because he's not speaking to our constituent needs. There is no process, to do that. So unless the document is intent, some of our laws are intentional about ways in which the people can be capacitated to have a direct control and come back into the process, and we are only going to be relying on institutions that can be easily captured, then it weakens our ability to be able to intervene in so many things. And then the last point I'll give as well is also, for instance, if we take the issue of prosecutions, right? Like so many of us may be frustrated that either Cecilia Dapa or somebody else is not being prosecuted, but we can't intervene. It has to be an Attorney General's mandate or initiative. But we used to have something we call private prosecutions, for instance. And so when you take out like the cases of things that the disparity between reports to the police and matters that are prosecuted, a lot of the times the issues that don't get prosecuted are crimes against women, rape, sexual harassment, things like that. But if women have the right to initiate private prosecutions, you best believe that they can initiate collective actions, they can organize, whether raise funding and things like that, to be able to themselves take up the prosecution of violence against women, which is under prioritized by the states. That's an example. So yeah, there are ways in which the people can mobilize, but I'm showing you the ways in which law also can better position the people to deploy their collective action or enterprises to make it even more effective in achieving the ends that we wanted to achieve as well. Yeah.
So it seems to me that we have laws that are very good at keeping us quiet or keeping us immobilized, like to kind of like you can kind of go through, because I know, like, for example, based on when you guys were arrested, you and your fellow jailbirds were arrested, and the lack of almost like we don't know what to do next, right? So it's like, okay, A, B, and C has happened, but what's next? Like there's no kind of flow chart or no kind of natural step in trying to gain that justice. And so before you joined, right at the beginning, we were discussing the definition of democracy, and we're kind of throwing all these different definitions around. And I shared this example that I found in the Journal of Democracy. Who knew there was a Journal of Democracy? And I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to highlight the section there, and it's called Modern Political Democracy is a system of governance in which rulers are held accountable for their actions in the public realm by citizens, acting indirectly through the competition and cooperation of their elected representatives. So if we're going by this definition of democracy, it seems as though our reality in Ghana doesn't reflect this, because there are not actual systems in place where you can hold these rulers to account in the public realm as citizens. So how do we, sorry, I feel like I'm putting the whole of Ghana on your shoulders here, but I feel like you feel like that every day, so who knows. How do we get there? I don't foresee politicians or power holders being like, you know what, yeah, let's stop this, right? And one of the things that I've always maintained is people who benefit from oppressive structures are not going to be the ones to break down those structures. So it's almost like, what do we do? Like, how do we actually get from point A to point B?
So one thing, and let me stay on the democracy thing a bit before I go to the next point that you mentioned, that one of the things that we've been successful and we keep emphasizing to our citizens is this direct linkage between our democracy is voting that we create. So the feeling generally is that to be democratic is to vote, and that's what our democracy is. And so because we've reduced it to electoral politics and not much more than that, it's created, I guess, this false sense, and you identified it very well. This false sense that we are in fact able to mobilize, we're in fact in control, but we are not. We are immobilized, and we have come to accept that all we have to do the barest minimum. We show up and vote, and that's it. That's an indication that we are in control of our democracy, whatever it is. And as long as that is the only way, in fact, an election is the employment letter of the political elite, right? So when we are showing up to vote, in fact, we are writing a new check to do that. We are not, in fact, holding accountable in the true sense of the word. So it has to be problematizing the way in which we put elections. And it showed, for instance, the latest Afrobarometer survey said 80% of Ghanaians believe that they'll show up to vote, and only 5% say they will go for a protest. So the system does so well in making you feel that our democracy is electoral and nothing more than that. And that requires education, and that requires intentional education to be able to change. Now, the question is whether or not we're getting that education within our classrooms. We're not necessarily getting that. And it's not a bad thing, because the system is intentionally designed to create that feeling of how you participate in the process. And so you might have even an NCCE, which is supposed to civic educate us. And the NCCE's biggest budget is spent around educating you on how not to waste your ballot, so how you vote properly. So civic education, the biggest budget they spend is also still about elections, more generally. So yeah, the education is the biggest framework to do that. But education that deconstructs our relationship with power a bit more, and in terms of how we view that relationship, I think it's missing. I feel that in terms of our public discourse and the serious ways in which power reacts to us or reinforces inequality and things like that, we are not very good in spotting it. And we are very good in jumping onto the narrative of sort of the law and order narrative that the state uses to oppress, more easily than anything. I was just having a conversation today with some folks in Mozambique, the crisis that is ongoing in Mozambique, and so many people have been killed after elections have been disputed in Mozambique. And very quickly, so many people have been killed. But the media has kind of shifted the conversation into, in the protest, some individuals went to loot some shops. So the whole conversation has turned into, these people are not true protesters. They are looters and they are criminals. And we are easy to be able to fall into those traps and narratives of where all we have to identify is one bad nut and shift the conversation to them and say, this is representative of how bad we Ghanaians are. An example is this recent conversation about somebody who was selling under the bridge, right? The interchange. And it's like, Ghanaians have done their thing again. We Ghanaians are our own problem, right? So we are looking for these things to be able to shift, and make ourselves the problem and believe it's almost like being in an abusive relationship where you always made to feel like you're not enough and you are the problem constantly. You're constantly second guessing yourself. And that's kind of how our relationship with the state works. Now, how do we do that? Yes, it's political education. There's very little avenues and access for people to educate themselves politically, to be a bit more reflective about the way in which the state reacts in our lives, about the continuation of the colonial project from those who have proclaim independence for us and their relationship with it, and the way in which they stepped into the colonizers' shoes, and how it affects us to this day. We don't have enough of those avenues. I mean, I guess if there were, Nori would not be seeking to enter into a space where it is very political education heavy and reform our relationship with the political thing. That's the first one. Two, I give 3 points. Two, we make this mistake constantly in terms of thinking that the more degrees is reflective of a person who has a social understanding of what the common or public goods we ought to get and the way to get them. Okay. But we know constantly that even in some of our highest institutions, whether you take the Mining Commission, you take the Forestry Commission and things like that, all the PhDs, their reaction and relationship with power is one of fear. People are mighty protective of, I might lose my job. Now, a person whose relationship is so defined by, I ought to please the politics, it doesn't matter what degrees they have, they do a disservice to you, no matter whatever space they have. So there's an absence of, courage and principle that ought to be more definitive of how those who are within the public space ought to react than they are more generally. And I can see it permeates every aspect of our lives, right? It permeates the ways in which we have ended up in this environmental crisis, because even when people have gone to the police to complain about galamsey or whatever it is, you're more likely than not to expect that nothing would happen if the person who show up is regional chairman of NPP or something. It happens on that level. It happens in the courts, where a court would be apprehensive or less likely to rule against the state because the state is involved and, I'm afraid of what might happen to him. So that absence of, it is not more education, but the one that requires that there's virtue in suffering the consequences of speaking up for good. There's some virtue in that. That's missing. So we are all avoidant, or we are all trying to create a situation whereby we can most protect ourselves and jobs and things like that if we don't speak up against injustice. So much so that in our space now, you can have climate or environmental activists or whatever it is, NGOs and things like that. But a politician will always be more respected than they are. It doesn't, we respect power more than those who are seeking to course correct, I would say. And then the final thing is, we have seen clearly that the problem is our low levels of organization and mobilization that happens. And so in previous times past, for instance, when we arrested and freed the citizens, that mobilized effort happened. So many people would have said, but Ghanaians did not do anything or would not have done anything prior. But we are seeing these signs of organizing and mobilizing that is happening in reaction to things which would not have happened in the past. And when we have seen, as a given example, when we have seen like activism and things like that died from the universities, which used to be the case in the 80s, now, for the first time, we are seeing people using the tool of Twitter and things like that, or in the general population, who are organizing around different themes. For the first time, to be able to see conversation on the scale like this, which is happening, where young Ghanaians have mobilized around an environmental issue of this significance, it's interesting to me, And even though you have had like the school boycotts and in children, protesting climate and other things happening in Europe and other places, and it feels like the conversation has almost messed up, you see the loop come back again with what has happened recently and being willing to step out and organize more. So I think that more organization, avenues for education, and redefining our relationship with power through being more courage-driven, these three things can perhaps push us forward in terms of what we are trying to achieve, I would say.
I mean, I like that that's your answer for obvious reasons. Yeah, I think for me, the education part, and the point that you made about the universities, historically being the place where activism sort of really grows, is something that I've observed kind of across the board. So, like, my PhD looks at the experiences of undergraduate students, but I have a whole section that talks about the fact that, like, in the UK, for example, we call it the marketization of education, where education, a degree level education became accessible to everybody. If you get a student loan, you can go to university, and which is great in lots of ways. But the fallout of that is it's created this kind of, I'm paying for you to teach me, therefore, like, I want to get this sort of school level quality of teaching. And there seems to be a lack of understanding of the role of university in society, because the people that would typically go to university, the demographic that would typically go to university now have changed. And so it's kind of almost diluted what universities do. And the same thing in America, actually. So when you see the recent protests in America, they're doing the protest on Palestine, the discourse has become, you know, you're meant to be there to study. This isn't what you're supposed to be doing at university. But actually, that is what university is supposed to do. It's supposed to shape society, whatever field and whatever kind of sector it is that you're in. So for me, for example, it's early childhood and education. And you and I had the conversation about Freire's book, Education for Critical Consciousness, and he talks a lot about this kind of civic level of education, but very grassroots, educating the public to grasp a critical understanding of their reality, and then almost how to advocate for themselves is kind of the easiest way that I can do it. I did have a whole section of presentation where I was going to break down what we're doing at Nori, but just because of time, I'm going to skip that whole part out. But that is our, I say our because Oliver's our board member, and our strategy for the next year, for 2025, is putting together this kind of civic education format and trying to figure out the best way to do that. So, you know, if you are somebody that is interested in supporting us and putting that together, you can do so financially, but also as a contributor, because trying to spread this information, whereas typically this knowledge would be exclusive to the university, I think we can utilize, as Edem was saying, we can utilize the media, we can utilize TikTok and YouTube and all of these other platforms to provide this civic education. Because I think for me, there's almost like a cultural, like you said, there's like a cultural, like an abusive relationship with the state, right? Where it's like, it's almost like you deserve your oppression because you haven't followed the rules. And I'll give an example. When you were arrested, there was this whole thing that kept dominating the discussion that Oliver took the keys. And it was driving me up the wall. And I'm like, did you like not see like the whole context of the situation? But you believe that somebody removing a key is worse than the worst thing that has happened in Ghana since we gained independence or something, is so reflective of like this sort of obedient, I don't want to use the word citizen, like just obedient thing that exists in this space to be manipulated. And I think that's where that weaponized poverty thing comes in. And even in some of the diaspora groups that I was in, that discussion about the woman under the flyover sort of crept in. And it was pretty much exactly what you're saying. And I was so surprised to see it coming from like non-locals, I would say. We never want to have anything nice, and all, like, it's this very weird, like, I don't know the word to use. It's very this weird undercurrent of like, you can always sit back and laugh at somebody and everything is okay. So the media will keep throwing these completely irrelevant, like, who's the majority and who cares? We have an election in like less than 20 days, right? Who's it like going to court for this and going to court for that, and all of these different distractions. Anyway, I don't want to go on a whole rant. So I think what would be, just because time has completely just flown by now, do you want to add anything before I open up for people?
Well, in the context of opening up, I've seen Kukue's question about, she says the legal education many of us received really address systemic oppression and what can be done to legal education itself, and with the young lawyers at the bar to improve education systems of justice. Have you found any of these successful with the lawyers you have worked with or supervised, right? And I'll start with, if there's any indication or show that the legal education is intended or isn't intended to be able to address questions of oppression, it's reflected on what we say, who are those who are qualified and deserve to be at the bar are. And if there's any bigger example of that is when, I'm a governor, identified themselves as being openly queer, and then that became disqualifying of somebody who deserves to be at the bar, for instance. And there's no reflection of law's rule in these questions about social denial and whatever it is. And also, even in terms of how they prepare them, things they say to them, you're not supposed to be taking a trot. You're supposed to hold yourself this way. Even in terms of the way we dress in court, the reason why it persists is because it is a marker of a distinction between us and them. The way in which language we use between my learned friend and those who are not lawyers cannot call themselves learned and things like that is a consistent reiteration, at least in the minds of those who the profession deems worthy of itself, that this is what you ought to view yourself at. And the society begins to internalize that very quickly. And so, for instance, even if it is myself going out for a protest, they'll be like, but you a lawyer, why are you joining the protest? It is that, no, lawyers don't go for protest. This is for poor people who go for protest. You have to, there's certain markers that the profession has been designed to create a feeling of, to other yourself and put yourself above somebody else, Now, that is only diagnosing the problem, which you've already done. The question, how do we fix it? That in my case, I've considered the reason why the law firm was established is also that it was supposed to be a microcosm of an approach to challenge and change people. That it was a continuation of some of the ideas of systemic reform that we were pursuing. So that bringing young lawyers in, first of all, challenging their relationship with capital and money is a big one, because the feeling and consistent one that you are made to feel as a lawyer is that you are there to make money. And that's the first point where we are trying to break down and attack within people's mind. Two, is also introducing them to diverse clientele that they might not necessarily have ever worked with or ever work with in different spaces. We are intentionally in seeking out unpopular clients or persons who work in spaces on issues which are those who the most socially desirable the system stigmatizes or deprioritizes as well. So that in terms of who you are constantly being made an advocate for, it has to be persons who are particular social class. And then we're introducing people as well to deal with people and questions of oppression or system, this thing that they would not ordinarily be introduced to in their social lives, and put them in the situations of discomfort. The whole firm experience is created in a way in which it is made expressly clear to you from the beginning that you are a different kind of lawyer, and we're intending a different kind of training and experience for you to have there at the firm. Even in terms of something as simple as the speaker series that we have at our firm, for instance, is also to introduce people to non-legal careers and non-legal perspectives more generally. One of the ones I loved more was somebody who dropped out of law school, in order to re-emphasize the feeling, even among our lawyers, that a person can drop out of law school and yet be a high-valued member of our society because they are solving other social problems in the way in which, the legal education reinforces other feelings. But and talk about the difficulties, one of the ones which I found the most difficult to cure is naturally the relationship with money and capital, and feeling like we ought to be making money, things like that. it's a difficult one. And you might ask me, what is the connection with that? Don't forget that the question, those who suffer the most oppression, one tends to be persons of a socioeconomic class which are underserved, so they don't have the money to pay for. They're also in areas of practice, for instance, criminal and other areas of practice, or human rights law, environmental, and things like that, where you receive the least money for. And so when you're convinced immediately that I need to be in insurance or other, all those, parts of the legal service industry, which are more financially rewarding, then you're already casting a particular relationship with how money as well reinforces systems of oppression more generally. So that is a constant one that we are continuing to deal with. But at the very least, I feel like those who are at the firm understand, obviously, that this is not a usual law firm and that there's something different here, and it is intentionally created that way. But I feel like it's continuing to be something that we will have to continue to work at to be able to produce the kind of lawyers we get. Incidentally, I don't know, for whatever reasons, a lot of young lawyers express, or those who are coming out from the schools express an interest in coming to the firm and working there. And I think that a lot of that is, many of them are interested in somebody who, or some firms which are trying to challenge the status quo in some way. So I think the interest in joining the firm itself, we are seeing a shift, which is perhaps an indication of something good. For the amount of interest we get for a relatively young firm, it's quite interesting and surprising, and I would say,
So we're opening up for questions now. So you can put your hands up if you have questions, or put them in the chat. I know, Edem, you had a couple of things that you wanted to say, so I'm going to come back to you in a second. But Oliver, I've got a question. My interests obviously lies in like children's rights and things like that. So if I was to use that as an example in terms of compelling international courts to maybe address something like, let's say, so let's say, for example, the impact on unborn children and children's health, etc. We are part of the UNCRC. And as the reality is, the UNCRC is not legally binding. It's a fluff piece at best. But we are members of the UNCRC. How could we leverage that as a starting point? As in, like, there's a violation of children's rights in general in Ghana, to be honest. Because I think one of the things when we were having like the LGBT conversation, and people are like, oh yeah, protect the children. I'm like, you don't care about the children when you're driving past them in traffic and they're there, like, barefoot begging you for food, and you're sending them away and shouting at them and swearing at them. You don't care about the children then. So in terms of the violation of children's rights as a platform for launching maybe some of these, obviously addressing those inequalities for children, but addressing some of these broader legal challenges, do you feel like that's something that, sorry, I feel like I'm putting you on the spot, but I feel like, is that something that could happen?
So perhaps because I'm primarily an international lawyer, I am more suspicious of these international forums than I think that generally we are. And I understand, in terms of general advocacy and things like that, we find some reassurance if the provincial or domestic complaints we have gain some broader international audience. There's some win we feel in that. Okay. But I want to talk about two things. The first one less direct, and the second one more direct. The less direct one is, I remember this scene from Hotel Rwanda, where as these images are going out, somebody had asked, but like, if America sees this or the world sees this image, of course, surely they're going to do something about it. And the person replied, yeah, they're going to be at their dinner table. They might raise their head and say, oh, this is terrible, and then go off and go on and eat their dinner. We have to be mindful of that. In the same way in which you and I continue to eat our dinner when we see the images of Gaza, just remember that other people are eating their dinner even as they watch us go by.
Yeah.
The second one is that the international courts or these platforms, what they can do is also to give audience to something. It can be a continuation of advocacy by another means to be able to bring them to the public attention. But they have less bite. One, in terms of all those things that go on beyond many of these courts, Ghana or many of these countries choose whether or not to even respond or interested in it. Whatever decisions that come out of that, there's no mechanism to enforce it.
Yeah.
And so there's nothing that can be done, about it. So
but do you feel
yeah.
Sorry to cut you. I feel like Ghana has this thing where it likes to look good on the public stage. So I feel like even just for that kind of, hey, this case has been brought against the Ghana government on the public stage, whether or not it would yield legal change, do you feel like the pressure of that would be enough to
Well, it reminds me of, I guess what you're saying. It reminds me of, there was an article which said that Professor No One is reading you, which is to emphasize that so many of the publications that were made in journals and stuff gets less read as compared to blogs.
Of course, yeah.
And I feel like I don't know how many people are taking an international court decision and reading it internationally. As compared to, say, a BBC article, for instance. So a BBC article might have maybe wider scope than even a decision of an international court. And I say this as well to maybe in some regard best the bevel of all these international courts that exist, feel like, oh yeah, by virtue of we issuing a decision, that's it. People are going to respect us more. The very few people know about them more generally. But also, yes, it's a currency that I hear people say a lot that we need to exploit, the sensitivity of our leaders to bad coverage internationally, and that we need to exploit more. I don't know one thing which we can say that because of the public international exposure and attention, we've course corrected. Surely, Galamsey sounds bad, right? The conversation around the use of some of these heavy metals and the way in which they might find themselves into cocoa pods and things like that have gone on for quite some time. I think that there is some truth in it, but also there's a limited scope in that. But yeah, I mean, it's a valid question as to what role they can play as well, and what are we looking for. So, for instance, in terms of this conversation about the recent arrest, obviously we're going to sue the state. But let's remember the first experience from last year when we sued the state. So we sue the state, let's say on Monday, the case is fixed for Thursday. We show up on Thursday, the court doesn't sit. Then, unknown to us, we write to the court and say, give us a new date by which we're supposed to come. The matter is fixed for the next Tuesday. Well, we're not in court. And so the judge says, 40 have sued the state on human rights. I've struck it out because you're clearly not interested. Less than a week, the court says they have struck it out. And this is in the human rights court. That already gives you an indication of where this is going. Well, it's been a year. We haven't moved past anywhere yet on that matter.
I guess it doesn't apply to treason charges, though.
Yes. Yes, of course. And then you have a court which are saying, like let's take the case of Benjamin, who was never even at the protest. And then, the state presents you and you don't even have anything to say. The judge says, in the interest of public interest, I am remanding you. So this is the conception of what is in the public interest as well. So because of all those, the ways in which we see lack of independence and things like that before the domestic courts, and it's not like we are hoping for money ensuing. We are hoping for that law changes. The law is more protective of activists and things like that. We are not getting it. So when we are going internationally, we have to redefine what we are seeking to do internationally. If we are seeking for direct law change, it is less proximate. It's less likely to happen. But if it is continuation of our advocacy through a different means, then surely yes. But let's be realistic about law. And I say this also primarily because some of us within this space can easily be so captivated by law and lawyers and things like that and think that law provides justice or that our activism must freeze because we are in court. And I think we're falling victim to that on so many occasions. We ought to be very mindful of these courts and whose court it is we have appeared and ceded our voice to when we are there. And one of the things which, for me, it's important, even as, even in terms of some of the environmental litigation we're seeing going on in the court or whatever it is, understand that there's more action to be gained outside the courts and in the courts. And I give this an example. Like, for instance, I see Daryl on the call. We've brought this, legal action on behalf of Arusha and others regarding mining in Forest Reserve. We haven't moved, we're back in court on the 3rd of December. We haven't moved far, but because of the protests, because of Oliver went to remove the police key, we were able to keep the conversation still within the public domain for so long that they're saying, okay, we are going to withdraw the bill. The LI and things like that. That we ought to see the courts only as part of the strategy and not the end of the strategy. So yeah, that's kind of what I would say about how we ought to use it. Let me perhaps take Tessa's question here, which I think it's a brilliant question as well. About, she's saying, somebody has asked about whether the 53 had legal support, and then she's wondering, does legal representation, even knowing the law, offer enough protection to activists in Ghana? Absolutely. I mean, we can all say absolutely not. In this case. But yeah, I have even advocated, particularly in distinct communities, that in working class communities, that claiming or knowing the law can even be more dangerous to you than ignorance of it, because with ignorance, you put yourself in a position where your relationship to the police is one of, please, I beg you, show me benevolence. With knowing the law gives you a false sense of confidence, of entitlement. But that would only work if the persons were ceding to that entitlement and recognizing the role of the law. They already knew the law when you didn't. And if they were inclined to respect it, they would have already. But yeah, that's the strange situation which we're caught in.
Gosh, okay. I have so many questions, but time. Okay, I see.
I'm sorry to depress you folks as well.
No. I think for me, it
but I mean, even in terms of
reassuring.
In terms of depressing you, once we are done, you can play the video of me removing the key. I think it can lift people's spirits, and we can go on from there.
I'll just send it around to everybody. But no, it's actually reassuring in lots of ways, because it shows that almost the things that I'm trying to do are on the right track, because ultimately it's still going to come down to education. When we were talking with Edem, we were talking about the utilization of the media, and one of the things that we did whilst you guys were locked up was obviously kept the hashtag going, etc. But then other platforms began to pick it up, so like international platforms began to pick it up, and then like some like random viral TikTok people started talking about it. And if we're able to sort of build that momentum, I think that plays a role. But ultimately, the education side of it, because you have pointed out that knowing the law is, can work against you if you, if you're stuck on some street somewhere with a policeman somewhere, and the very sort of the harsh reality of, like, if you get arrested, for example, not even being able to notify your family and your friends and your lawyer, and a very blatant blocking access to your lawyer, which is like such a fundamental thing, happens, and everybody knows that it happens. So like I said, you can't really rely on the law. Yeah. But anyway, before we go down that route, we've got a hand, Bobbit Pateo. Sorry, I hope I said your name correctly. If you do have a question, and this is time to put your hand up, we've got like 20 minutes left. So yeah, Bobbit.
So my question is for Tenielle, and I wanted to talk about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and how that invested heavily in African infrastructures. How sustainable are these projects in terms of a long-term economic growth for African countries?
Thank you, Bobit, for that question. So I kind of went over the One Belt, One Road initiative, but essentially the investments. So one key part of the Belt Road Initiative is Chinese investments into African infrastructures. And the statistics report that these investments lead African countries into debt, billions of US dollars in debt. So long-term fiscally, it does not lead them down the right path, but there's so many different facets to this. It's not just the Chinese making all these deals. There has to be a receiver on the end. And we were just discussing how a lot of local governments are not doing their part to maintain a mutually beneficial relationship, but rather, and of course, this is depending on which local government or leader you're talking about, but a lot of them come with their own personal interests, and they put that before national interests, before the local economy's interests. So it's really sad to see, but unfortunately, if this is the road that local African governments are going to continue to go down with their partnerships, because China is not going to change their strategy or motive, then unfortunately, you're going to see this one-way lender-borrower type of relationship going on, and it will always be unbalanced and unequal, where China will always have the upper hand. And I think my mom is in the chat, and she just sent a question. What is the bigger picture when it comes to China's investment into Africa? What is seeming to be their overall goal? Yes, okay, so this is a great question. I was just talking about this as well in the comment section, but China is not investing into Africa because of a business move or to make a profit. There is no incentive for them to do that because there are a lot of African countries in debt, so that it's not a suitable investment for them. They're doing this to wield some sort of soft power over African countries, and they want to basically establish themselves in more infrastructures so that they can be the ones to say, we are the ones that got Kenya, we are the ones that got Ghana out of poverty, or we are the ones that helped accelerate their fiscal growth, we are the ones that funded all of their schools. However, when you really look at really how much they're helping in the long term, you can see that in actuality, it's so off balance, and they're more so hurting the sovereignty and autonomy of local government management of these businesses, because a lot of these public sectors of local infrastructures where politicians are making deals with Chinese businesses, it then becomes a private sector because Chinese businesses will take on over these public sectors. And then where's the power here? It's not even in the local government's hands. It's not in the manager's hands. It's in China's hands. So it's kind of like the government's retaining their power and giving it over to someone else just because they want the money. So there needs to be more structural frameworks when it comes to the negotiation table, in order for African countries and especially their governments to retain their power. So, yes.
Thank you. And hi, Mom. Okay, Edem, I'm going to unmute you because you have a question. And it says, the relationship between civil society, academics, and media in advocacy, is it good enough? Could it be improved? And how could it be better?
I don't think it's good enough. I think that we should very much be looking to improve it, because the whole point of being an academic is to do research, and your research is nothing if it doesn't transform a society and it's not beneficial to whatever context that you're doing your research in, right? I think Oliver mentioned something about Professor, nobody is reading you or something like that. I think a part of the problem is that, like lawyers who say, the thing about class, my status is changed because I have a PhD or whatever it is, but it doesn't. And so we use all these jargons, technical terms that nobody outside of our discipline can probably understand, right? We need to be able to use language that is accessible to everyone. So part of what I'm trying to do with my PhD is to have a website where some of like content is going to go there so that everybody is going to be able to access, right? So if you haven't published your dissertation in a journal article or something like that, nobody has access to it, right? It's sitting somewhere because you're waiting to publish a book so that you can make money from it or something like that, right? We need to be able to disseminate our research because it should be for the greater good of everyone. And make it accessible so that people can read and understand. The thing with the relationship between academia, civil society, and media is that the media, so if you make your work accessible like that, with, you know, a country where people speak multiple languages, for example, then the media's job here would be to translate whatever it is into the various local languages, because you already have local languages, people speaking local, journalists speaking local languages on their various media houses, right? So what you do is to translate that for the everyday person, and same goes with civil society institutions. The relationship should be reciprocal. So you depend on the media, but the media also, you know, going back to the thing about media not doing fact checking or not going behind the he said, she said, this is where civil society and academia comes in. So you're relying on civil society or in academics who have done the work that would probably take you several years to do. So you're relying on them rather than every day going to politicians and saying, oh, this Odo River or Gata, you know, how are we going to, the minister said we're going to spend 30 million to, you know, to get this work done. But what is civil society saying, or what work has civil society done in that regard? Have they done any work in that regard that provides you any counter information? Same with academics. Has anybody done any research in that regard? Has it happened in have other countries done it? How have they done it? And what can we learn from their experiences, right? So I think this is how, I think it's an issue of collaboration and recognizing that these are all resources that we can rely on for the greater good of society, rather than making it a thing of making it a class thing, right? Because like also, if a media house is funded by a politician or it's owned by a politician, they're not going to allow you to probably speak to civil society who may have information that sort of counters what your political party or something is saying, right? So we need to, I think the issue is more than that, but I think collaboration and inherently wanting the society to become better, it's gonna probably not solve all of it, but we can solve some of it, and I think that would be a greater step. I don't know if I am responding appropriately to the question, but
you know what, you touched on so many things, and one of the things, the whole point why I established the institute was for this, because my PhD looks at the one of the things that I talk about is that there's a block, right, between what happens in academia and how that knowledge is disseminated to the public, and this is like a global thing.
Yeah.
And academics now are taking a stand in publishing more open access things. Now, how it works in academia is a lot of open access journals are not seen as quote unquote high impact, right? So this is where that class and power and privilege and all those things come in. So if you're publishing in a open access journal, that's almost seen as a low impact journal, or not as prestigious as another type of journal.
Yeah.
So what lots of people are doing is publishing in the quote unquote high impact journal, but then publishing on their website or doing all the kind of stuff. But what I wanted to do with Nori was to create a space where researchers could do that research, and then we could publish it, and like I was saying, translate it in all these different languages, because that empowerment of people, that the withdrawal of knowledge, almost like a colonization of knowledge, is a weapon that's used against us. And the media, I think you're very right in that the media should be the arm that does that, but it seems to not do that. So I think, again, maybe taking control of the narrative in our own ways and using our own platforms, because actually now there's so many ways for us to put that information out there that all of these things are almost non-issues, because traditional media is important. But yeah, very, very key points there. I'm going to go to Daryl.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I just wanted to speak briefly to the question on whether the Belt and Road initiatives by China are sustainable. So I think there was some very good feedback on the fiscal bit of it in terms of the fiscal sustainability. But what we have also not considered in all of this is also the loss of natural capital, or the loss of natural capital assets, because these Belt and Road initiative has been known to actually affect not less than 1,000 ecological habitats and spaces, which are also more or less what you call nature-based solutions for building resilience for most African countries who don't have the capacity as the developed world has. And so when you come and you fragment forest reserves, which are the sources of food for communities, and you also undertake dam projects, that also eventually lead to flooding of communities. You leave a lot of communities still exposed, but you're only thinking about how much it costs, what debt I have to pay, but you not take into consideration the environmental costs as a result of the infrastructure project that these Belt and Road Initiative is going to also unleash upon some of the communities. So I think it's also another aspect that we need to look at, not always looking at the fiscal debts and associated costs, but also the loss to environmental services and ecosystems that are going to be affected. And this was one of the key aspects of, I'll say, our campaign, when we're actually campaigning on saving Atua Forest as far back as between 2012 and 2016, and now between 2017 up to now. So it's a big issue that also needs to be taken into consideration when you're looking at sustainability. And then there was also a point made by Edem on how the academics and the educational institutions can support some of these advocacy. The thing is that I would say is that we've not seen our academics rise to occasion when they need to speak truth to power. And I think Oliver did mention it, that they are more concerned about the positions they hold in the institutions. They are afraid to write papers, even if they've done research that contradicts what politicians are saying. They never come out with it until civil society start talking. And there's only a few people who really find the courage to come, because I think what we've seen is that most people, when they eventually do, they get tagged as belonging to a particular political party. And some of these doctors and professors don't want to get tagged in some of these narratives. So they rather choose to stay back and not get involved in some of these very controversial narratives. And this is something I think we need to find a way to deal with. Otherwise, it's always going to be, like Oliver said, those we consider not too educated who are fighting on the street, and those who don't have anything to lose, probably those who are not publicly employed or civil servants or not appointed, who have to speak up. And we can't always live by that if that's going to be the only way for which we are going to deal with the oppression that we are faced with now.
That is great. Thank you. Thank you very much. So we are kind of at the end now. I don't see any additional questions, so maybe we can do like final word. So Daryl, as you have the mic, do you want to say your final word?
Yes, I just want to say that. So I was constantly looking at participants on this discussion, and I feel that it's a very good discussion. Maybe we need to broaden the scope. And I think we need to understand that if we are going to be successful at dealing with some of the issues we are confronted with, be it environmental challenges or fiscal, financial, whatever it is, we need to deal with our leadership. Our current crop of leadership is not rising up to living up to our needs. And I think this is what we need to address. And I think there needs to be a system change, and that system change must start with getting rid of the kind of corrupt leadership that we have. And I think that we can't succeed with our advocacy if there's a right person in our court. There's a wrong person in our courts, and there's a wrong person enforcing the laws of this country. So we need to start with the leaders. If the leaders are right, I'm sure we'll not see ourselves as victims.
That is beautiful. Thank you very much. Tenielle, final word?
Yes, so I just want to say that first off, thank you for having me on this panel. But yes, just a concluding remark. I would have to say that it's really up to the local governments to really work on their negotiating power when it comes to China, in order to support a mutually beneficial relationship so that they can further support national interests, economic growth, and yes, as Daryl pointed out, environmental sustainability as well. So the government has a lot of work to do, and they need to bring in experts, they need to bring in local consultants, they need to invest heavily in local skill set to hone in the skills of what their community already has, so that they can I guess, further advance their skill set and keep them within the country instead of having to force them to leave and look elsewhere.
That is fabulous. Thank you. I'm not sure if they want to be fair, but that's great. Thank you. Okay, Oliver, final word?
I think it's very difficult to not be depressed in light of other things that we see, and even in terms of even the conversation we are having. But one of the things I say, and a lot of the times people say to me, and I'll say this to all of us, people say to me that, why do I keep fighting knowing that nothing is going to change? Knowing all I know, or that they presume that there's a certain level of naivete on my part in believing that systems can change or anything like that. And one of the things I say is that knowing what we are up against better sharpens your advocacy and what you're doing. It gives you a better sense of purpose. I remember when we first started, the conversation around constitutional reforms, and some of the young people had given a talk like this, telling them about how long it might take. And I was projecting that it might take us 5 to 10 years. And I think that so many of them resigned there and then that, no, this is not for me. So it is not a lack of awareness. Like our activism is not made more important or made more beautiful by a lack of our awareness of the challenges ahead of us. It is better sharpened and defined by our awareness of what the challenges are. And that's one of the things we ought to keep in our mind. 2 is that an awareness of the challenges should not demobilize us. Because if not, then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The idea that this is so difficult and so nothing ought to be done about it. No systems have been created. And I give this example that Albert Lutuli won the Nobel Peace Prize for apartheid in the 60s. South Africa got its democracy in 1994. Systems take a while to change. But they don't change because time has passed. They change because people consistently have given their energies and their industries to time. Now, if you want to do this kind of work and be engaged in the process of transforming society, you have to learn to decenter yourself. Remember that there's so many people who have come before you and have gone to be able to make you do here. And your role is to be a connecting bridge between what this generation and tomorrow's generation, that the activism can become easy, a little easier. And anything we can do to make their load lighter, that's our role. So that We shouldn't be caught in the belief that things ought to change in our lifetime for our work to have meaning. No. Maybe our place in all of this historical process is to better capacitate and lighten the load of tomorrow. And that too is okay. That's my last words.
That's beautiful. I think I've had similar conversations with people about how long things take. And I always make the comment that the oppressors never talk about how long it takes to oppress the people. And the example that I always look at is if you look at the history of like slavery, transatlantic slavery, I think a lot of time when we talk about it, we talk about it as if like the Europeans just arrived and then colonized the next day and that was it. It was literally 90 years of trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing before they were able to get a foothold and changing strategies. 90 years is a very long time, especially back in the day, because people weren't living that long. Which means that somebody started, their son, inherited, and then their son inherited, and their son inherited, and carried on this vision, and they carried it on for hundreds of years. So, yeah, I really like that, and it is quite motivating. Let's try Edem. Edem, are you there?
Yeah, I am.
Yay! Final word, please.
I think it's probably not going to be on media or anything, but generally on activism. I think that and this, but I'm sharing this publicly as well, is that when the 53 got arrested, one of the first things that I said that this should be the last time we do any protests like that, because I said that out of frustration and I was demoralized, right? A lot of the times when we say that people should lend their voices to causes and show up and protest, people don't, right? And the effect is that the government does not it's not just getting away with what they're doing, but also forms part of their ability to silence people, right? So imagine if as many people as possible showed up for the first 2 days or 3 days that this protest had been called on. How many people were they going to be to arrest? And I think we should also get past that thinking that we need to be respectful, for us to get what they will never give you what you want. Even when they're not giving it to you, right? We need to understand that it is called activism for a reason, and like we've said, it's going to take years, but we need to start now. We need to lay the foundation. I don't think any proper change has happened anywhere in the world from people just saying, I beg, I beg, I beg. And it never happens that way. Like blood and sweat and pain and all of that, people will say, well, I don't want to be the one who gets killed. Well, you're getting killed anyways, or you're going to die anyways, right? It's better to die for a cause than to die for nothing, so I'm just using this platform, and also especially for people in the diaspora, is to lend your voices to the cause, and don't think that I am insulated. I'm in the UK or Canada or Europe or anywhere in North America and not on the continent. So whatever they do to themselves is none of my business. Well, we still have family there, right? And you're probably going to be working extra hard. So imagine that you're in for example, in Canada, for example, you have family that's in Ghana, and then they went to a public hospital and they cannot be treated there. They're going to go to a private hospital. That's going to cost you more. And if you're a breadwinner, it means that you're going to have to work harder here, right? So you might say that, so it's none of my business, but you're not thinking about the other ways that indirectly it's impacting the way that you live as a person, right? And so we should be able to lend our voices to causes and know that when somebody is not willing to change something, it means that it's benefiting them. you know, and we must not continue to allow that to happen. So whenever there are protests in the diaspora, if you can, and back at home, you should join and spread the word, because Ghana is doing a very good job with their PR when it comes to their international image. So we should be able to disrupt that as well. So those are my last words.
Thank you, Edem. So that's it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. So as I said, what we're trying to achieve as an organization is creating dialogue that affects change. And my key takeaway is the focus on education, and that is actually our focus for the next year, is kind of putting out educating people on different levels, the civic education, understanding of people's rights, and empowering people through education, which is basically the crux of what we do. My vision for Nori is to establish this research center that finds these solutions to problems and then educates people about them. It's pretty simple, really. My background is education. You know, in an ideal world, I would be playing on the floor with children in the nursery, but there's too many issues that distracts me from doing that. And I feel like we have to kind of address these broader issues before we can really create a better, like, let children thrive, right? So yeah, that's it really. Thank you so much for coming. And again, I apologize for that interruption that we had earlier. If you do feel like supporting our work, in the emails, the Go link, the GoFundMe link is there. But also your contributions, right? So ideas that you have. We're going to be having more of these conversations about different topics. If you want to educate anybody, if you have anything that you want to share to the masses as far as education goes, also get in contact with me. Yes, any questions or comments from anybody before I end? I never know how to end these things. It's always so awkward. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.